Welcome to a journey through the mysterious realms of the Boiling Isles, where magic flows through every twisted tree and ancient secret. Tonight, we'll explore the complete lore of the Owl House, from the primordial origins of wild magic to Luz's transformative journey between worlds. This is a story of outcasts finding belonging, of magic both wonderful and terrible, and of the courage to choose your own path. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift into a realm where witches soar on staffs and demons become family. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let's begin. In the beginning, before time had learned to measure itself in moments and memory, before the very concepts of magic and mundane had found their separate paths through existence, there was only the vast emptiness of space, punctuated by beings of such immense power and ancient wisdom that their thoughts could reshape reality itself. These were the Titans, colossal entities whose very existence defied the understanding of lesser minds. Creatures so enormous that their bodies could serve as foundations for entire worlds. The Titan, whose story we follow tonight, was unlike any other member of its cosmic species, for within its heart burned a flame of compassion that set it apart from its peers. Where other Titans might have viewed the smaller creatures of the universe with indifference or even contempt, this ancient being felt a profound connection to all forms of life, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Its massive form drifted through the cosmic void for eons beyond counting, observing the birth and death of stars, watching as countless civilizations rose and fell like waves upon some impossible shore. Yet for all its power, for all its wisdom accumulated across millennia of existence, the Titan carried within itself a growing sadness. It had witnessed too much suffering, too many worlds consumed by darkness, too many species extinguished before they could reach their full potential. The weight of cosmic loneliness pressed down upon its consciousness like the gravity of a collapsed star, and it began to contemplate a sacrifice that would echo through dimensions yet to be born. The decision, when it finally crystallized in the Titan's vast mind, was one of such profound selflessness that it would fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself. This ancient being, whose power could have reshaped galaxies according to its will, chose instead to give up its own existence so that something greater might flourish in its place. It was a choice born not from despair but from hope, not from defeat but from the ultimate victory of love over indifference. The Titan's death was unlike anything the universe had ever witnessed. As its life force ebbed away, the massive body did not simply cease to exist, but began a transformation that would take millennia to complete. The flesh became earth, rich and fertile beyond imagining. The bones became mountains and valleys, creating a landscape of impossible beauty and terrible grandeur. The blood became rivers and seas that would nourish countless generations of life yet to come. But it was the Titan's heart that underwent the most magnificent transformation of all. As the last spark of consciousness faded from the ancient being's mind, its heart did not simply stop beating, but began to pulse with a new kind of energy entirely. This was the birth of magic itself, not as some abstract force, but as the living essence of the Titan's sacrifice, a power source so pure and potent that it would serve as the foundation for an entire realm of existence. The heart continued to beat long after the Titan's body had settled into its final resting position, each pulse sending waves of magical energy throughout what would become known as the demon realm. This energy was wild and untamed, flowing freely through every particle of the transformed landscape, creating conditions where the impossible became commonplace and the miraculous was simply another fact of daily existence. From this magical essence emerged the first inhabitants of the new realm, beings that embodied the chaotic beauty of wild magic itself. These were not demons in any malevolent sense, but rather manifestations of the Titan's diverse imagination, creatures that defied easy classification and celebrated the boundless creativity that magic made possible. Some took forms that might seem monstrous to outsider eyes, while others appeared deceptively familiar, but all shared the common heritage of having been born from the Titan's loving sacrifice. The landscape itself became a living testament to the power of unrestricted magic. Trees grew in spirals that reached toward alien skies, their branches bearing fruit that could grant temporary wishes or induce prophetic dreams. Rivers flowed uphill when the mood struck them, their waters changing color with the seasons of magic rather than the turning of celestial bodies. Mountains rearranged themselves according to principles that had nothing to do with geology and everything to do with the aesthetic preferences of the magical currents that flowed through them. In this realm, the very air shimmered with possibilities. A casual thought could manifest as a butterfly of pure light, while a deeply felt emotion might crystallize into a gemstone that would preserve that feeling for centuries. The boundary between the inner world of consciousness and the outer world of physical reality became fluid, allowing for forms of expression and experience that would be impossible in realms governed by more rigid natural laws. The creatures that emerged from this magical primordial soup were as diverse as the Titan's imagination had been vast. Some were beings of pure energy who danced through the air like living auroras, their forms shifting and changing with each movement. Others were more substantial, creatures of horn and claw and scale who nevertheless possessed wisdom that spanned generations. There were beings who existed partially outside of normal time, able to remember futures that had not yet come to pass and forget pasts that had never really happened. Among these early inhabitants were the ancestors of what would eventually become the major species of the Boiling Isles. The proto-witches, who would one day develop the ability to channel magic through bile sacs, evolved from creatures that lived in perfect harmony with the wild magical currents, their bodies naturally adapting to serve as conduits for the Titan's ongoing gift. The demons, who would become the realm's most distinctive inhabitants, took on forms that reflected the infinite creativity that unrestricted magic allowed. The relationship between these early creatures and the magic that surrounded them was one of perfect symbiosis. They did not seek to control or limit the wild energies, but rather learned to dance with them, to become partners in an ongoing cosmic ballet that celebrated the beauty of chaos and the power of adaptation. Magic was not seen as a tool to be wielded, but as a living force to be respected and collaborated with. For countless eons, this primal paradise existed in a state of perfect balance. The Titan's heart continued to pulse with steady rhythm, each beat sending fresh waves of magical energy throughout the realm. The creatures that called this place home lived in harmony with forces that would have torn apart less adaptable worlds, their very existence a testament to the power of life to flourish even in the most extraordinary circumstances. The seasons in this realm were not marked by the changing position of celestial bodies, but by the shifting moods and energies of the magic itself. During the season of growing light, new forms of magical creatures would spontaneously generate from the intersection of starlight and Titan's blood, while the season of deepening shadows would see ancient spells taking on temporary physical form to dance through midnight forests before dissolving back into pure possibility. The very concept of death, as understood in other realms, held little meaning here. When one of the magical creatures reached the end of its current incarnation, its essence would simply flow back into the great reservoir of Titan's magic, ready to emerge again in new and unexpected forms. This cycle of transformation meant that wisdom accumulated over generations, with each new manifestation carrying within it the distilled experiences of all who had come before. The landscape itself participated in this ongoing transformation. Valleys would reshape themselves to better channel the flow of magical currents, while forests would migrate across continents following the seasonal patterns of mystical energy. The very stones beneath the surface would rearrange themselves into configurations that better reflected the mathematical principles underlying wild magic, creating geometries that existed in dimensions beyond the merely spatial. It was during this golden age of unrestricted magical flow that the fundamental laws governing the demon realm were established, not through conscious legislation, but through the organic evolution of principles that promoted harmony between all forms of life and magic. These were not rigid rules, but rather flexible guidelines that adapted themselves to changing circumstances, while maintaining the core principle that magic should serve life rather than dominating it. The Titan's influence extended far beyond the merely physical transformation of its body into landscape. Its consciousness, even in death, continued to permeate every aspect of the realm it had created, serving as a gentle guiding presence that helped maintain the delicate balance between order and chaos that allowed such diverse forms of life to flourish together. This guiding consciousness manifested in countless subtle ways. Young creatures learning to interact with magic would find themselves instinctively drawn toward approaches that harmonized with, rather than conflicted with, the wild energies around them. Ancient conflicts between different species would resolve themselves as the deeper unity underlying their apparent differences became apparent to all involved parties. The Titan's wisdom also revealed itself in the way the realm's geography naturally evolved to provide perfect habitats for every form of life that emerged within its boundaries. Dense forests of carnivorous plants created ecosystems where predator and prey relationships existed in perfect balance, while crystal caves provided meditation spaces for creatures whose consciousness operated on timescales measured in geological epochs rather than individual lifetimes. The magic itself seemed to possess a form of consciousness, responding to the needs and dreams of the creatures it touched with an intelligence that suggested something far greater than mere force or energy. Spells would evolve and adapt themselves to better serve their casters, while magical artifacts would develop personalities that reflected the hopes and fears of those who created them. This was the world that existed before the coming of control, before the establishment of artificial limitations, before the tragic division of magic into separate categories and schools. It was a realm where the only law was love, the only limit was imagination, and the only requirement was respect for the sacred gift that the Titan's sacrifice had made possible. The arrival of Philip Witterbane in the demon realm was not marked by fanfare or cosmic significance, yet it would prove to be one of the most catastrophic events in the realm's history. Like a stone cast into still water, his presence would create ripples that would eventually become tsunamis, transforming a world of wild magic and boundless possibility into something darker and more constrained than its creators ever intended. Philip came from the human realm of Gravesfield, a settlement in what would later become Connecticut. During an era when fear of witchcraft ran through communities like a plague of suspicion and hatred. The year was 1663, and the young man who would eventually become Emperor Belos carried within his heart all the prejudices and certainties of his time, beliefs that would prove as toxic to the demon realm as any poison ever devised. He was not alone when he first crossed the threshold between worlds, though by the time his story reached its conclusion, he would be more alone than any soul should ever have to endure. With him came his elder brother Caleb, the most important person in Philip's young life, and the one whose loss would eventually drive him to become a monster beyond all recognition or redemption. The two brothers had discovered the portal to the demon realm through means that remained shrouded in mystery, though fragments of evidence suggest they encountered a witch named Evelyn, who had found her way to the human realm and fallen in love with Caleb's gentle nature and open mind. Where Philip saw only danger and corruption, Caleb saw wonder and possibility, a difference in perspective that would ultimately tear their bond apart and reshape the destiny of two entire worlds. Caleb's reaction to the demon realm was one of immediate fascination and joy. Here was a place where the impossible became routine, where magic flowed as freely as water, and where creatures of incredible diversity lived together in harmony despite their vast differences. The young man, who had grown up in a world governed by rigid religious doctrine and social hierarchy, found himself enchanted by a realm where creativity and adaptation were valued above conformity and control. For Philip, however, the demon realm represented everything he had been taught to fear and despise. The wild magic that Caleb found so beautiful appeared to Philip as chaotic corruption, while the diverse creatures that populated this strange land seemed like demons straight from the theological nightmares of his childhood. Every wonder that delighted his brother only deepened Philip's conviction that this was a realm of evil that needed to be purged from existence. The breaking point came when Philip discovered that Caleb had not merely befriended the witch Evelyn, but had fallen deeply in love with her. To Philip's rigid worldview, this was not simply a romantic entanglement, but a fundamental betrayal of everything their human heritage represented. His brother, the person he loved most in all the world, had been seduced by the very forces of darkness that Philip had dedicated his life to opposing. The confrontation between the brothers was as inevitable as it was tragic. Caleb, transformed by his experiences in the demon realm and his relationship with Evelyn, tried desperately to help Philip understand that everything they had been taught about witches and magic was wrong. The creatures of this realm were not demons, but simply different forms of life. The magic was not corruption, but a beautiful natural force, and the love he shared with Evelyn was as pure and sacred as any bond blessed by the churches of their homeland. Philip's response was swift and final. In a moment of rage and perceived righteousness, he struck down his own brother, committing the act of fratricide that would haunt him for centuries to come and set him on the path toward becoming the greatest evil the demon realm had ever known. Yet even as Caleb's blood stained the ground between them, Philip convinced himself that he had acted out of necessity, that he had freed his brother's soul from the corruption that had claimed it. But the murder of Caleb was only the beginning of Philip's descent into darkness. Stranded in the demon realm with no way to return home and consumed by guilt that he refused to acknowledge, Philip found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his unnaturally extended existence. He could accept responsibility for what he had done, seek to understand the world his brother had loved, and perhaps find some path toward redemption. Instead, he chose to double down on his hatred and prejudice, convincing himself that the demon realm itself was responsible for Caleb's corruption and death. If this world of magic had not existed, his brother would never have been led astray. If these creatures had never encountered humanity, Caleb would still be alive. The solution, in Philip's twisted logic, was not to change himself but to change the world, to transform it into something that aligned with his narrow vision of righteous order. This decision set Philip on a path that would consume centuries of his life and ultimately cost countless innocent souls their freedom and lives. Unable to accept that his own actions had led to his brother's death, he projected his guilt and self-hatred outward, targeting the entire demon realm as the source of all evil and corruption in the universe. The transformation from Philip Witterbane the human into Emperor Belos the tyrant did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process of moral compromise and spiritual corruption that unfolded across decades and then centuries, each step away from his original humanity, making the next step easier to justify and accept. Initially, Philip's exposure to wild magic was purely accidental and defensive, surrounded by creatures and forces that his human physiology was never designed to interact with. He found himself absorbing trace amounts of magical energy simply by existing in this transformed environment. These early exposures were small and seemingly harmless, but they began to change him in ways that were both subtle and profound. The first changes were physical. Philip's aging process slowed dramatically. His human lifespan extended far beyond its natural boundaries by the wild magic that permeated every breath he took. His strength and endurance increased, while his resistance to injury and disease grew to supernatural levels. To most observers, these might have seemed like beneficial adaptations, but they came with a terrible cost that Philip either could not or would not acknowledge. Each infusion of wild magic into his human system created conflict at the most fundamental level of his being. Magic in the demon realm was meant to flow freely and harmoniously, adapting itself to the natural rhythms and needs of the creatures it touched. Philip's rigid human psychology and deep-seated hatred of magic itself created a kind of spiritual toxicity that poisoned every magical interaction he experienced. Where others learned to dance with wild magic, Philip fought against it, seeking to dominate and control forces that were meant to be partnered with rather than conquered. This internal conflict between his human nature and the magical energies he was absorbing created a corruption that spread throughout his entire being, transforming him into something that was neither fully human nor properly magical, but a twisted hybrid that belonged to neither world. The psychological changes were even more disturbing than the physical ones. Philip's already rigid worldview became increasingly extreme and paranoid as the years passed. His memories of Caleb became idealized and distorted, while his recollections of their final confrontation shifted to place all blame on external forces rather than his own choices and actions. He began to experience visions and hallucinations, though he interpreted these as divine revelations rather than symptoms of his growing madness. In these distorted perceptions, he saw himself as a holy warrior, chosen by higher powers to cleanse the demon realm of its corruption and restore it to some imagined state of purity that had never actually existed. The tragedy of Philip's transformation was that it was largely self-inflicted. The wild magic of the demon realm was not inherently corrupting or evil, as evidenced by the countless creatures who lived in harmony with these forces for millennia. The corruption came from Philip's own refusal to accept or adapt to his new environment. His insistence on viewing everything through the lens of his prejudices and fears. As the decades turned to centuries, Philip's consumption of wild magic became more deliberate and aggressive. No longer content to absorb trace amounts through environmental exposure, he began actively seeking out and consuming magical creatures and artifacts, convincing himself that he was purifying these sources of corruption by taking their power into himself. Each act of magical cannibalism made him stronger in terms of raw power, while simultaneously making him weaker in terms of his fundamental humanity. The creatures he consumed added their abilities to his growing arsenal of supernatural powers, but their deaths also added to the weight of guilt and madness that he carried within his increasingly twisted soul. The physical manifestations of this corruption became more pronounced as time passed. Philip's human form began to deteriorate and warp, his flesh taking on an increasingly artificial and mechanical appearance as the wild magic he consumed fought against his essential nature. He learned to disguise these changes through illusion and careful presentation, but beneath the surface, he was becoming something monstrous. The development of his ultimate plan, the Day of Unity, emerged from this centuries-long process of corruption and self-deception. Unable to accept that his own choices had led to his current state, Philip projected his internal conflict onto the entire population of the demon realm. If everyone else could be made to share his suffering, if the wild magic that tormented him could be stripped away from all who possessed it, then perhaps his own pain might finally end. The Day of Unity was never truly about unity at all, despite its deceptively benevolent name. It was an elaborate suicide murder scheme designed to allow Philip to destroy everything he blamed for his own corruption, while convincing himself that he was performing an act of salvation rather than genocide. In his twisted logic, death was preferable to the free expression of wild magic, and he would provide that death to every magical creature in the realm, whether they wanted his salvation or not. To achieve this monstrous goal, Philip realized that he would need more than just his own accumulated power and madness. He would need to create a system of control that could manage and ultimately destroy an entire civilization of magical beings. This realization led him to develop the persona of Emperor Belos and begin the long process of conquest that would transform the demon realm from a paradise of wild magic into a totalitarian state designed to facilitate its own destruction. The creation of the first Grimwalker marked a crucial turning point in Philip's descent into ultimate evil. Unable to bear the loneliness of his centuries-long existence and tormented by memories of the brother he had murdered, Philip used his accumulated magical knowledge to create an artificial recreation of Caleb, hoping to somehow undo his greatest crime through supernatural means. The process of creating a Grimwalker required ingredients and knowledge that spoke to the depths of Philip's corruption. He needed the bone of the Autet, a fragment of Caleb's remains that he had preserved across the centuries like a twisted religious relic. He needed Golderstone, Selkagris, and Stonesleeper lungs, rare magical materials that could only be obtained through extensive knowledge of the demon realm's most dangerous creatures and locations. But most disturbing of all, he needed palistrom wood, the same magical substance that was used to create the staffs that allowed witches to fly and channel their magic. The irony was not lost on those who would later discover the truth. Philip was using the very materials that enabled magical freedom to create a being designed to help him destroy that freedom forever. The first Grimwalker was both a triumph and a catastrophe for Philip's diseased psyche. On one level, the artificial being looked exactly like his beloved brother Caleb, possessed many of the same mannerisms and personality traits, and provided Philip with the companionship he had craved for centuries. For brief moments, he could almost convince himself that he had somehow undone his greatest sin and restored his brother to life. But the Grimwalker was not truly Caleb, and Philip's attempts to recreate their original relationship were doomed to failure from the beginning. The artificial being had no memory of their shared childhood, no understanding of the events that had shaped Philip's worldview, and no capacity to provide the forgiveness that Philip desperately sought, but would never ask for directly. Worse still, the Grimwalker possessed the same capacity for independent thought and moral development that had originally led Caleb to reject Philip's rigid worldview. As time passed, the artificial brother began to question Philip's plans and methods, developing the same compassion for magical creatures and the same appreciation for wild magic that had originally driven Philip to murder his real brother. The cycle repeated itself with inevitable tragedy. Unable to accept that the problem lay within himself, rather than in the independent thinking of his companions, Philip destroyed the first Grimwalker just as he had destroyed Caleb, convincing himself once again that he was preventing corruption rather than perpetuating it. This pattern would repeat itself across the centuries, with Philip creating Grimwalker after Grimwalker, each one a desperate attempt to recreate the relationship he had destroyed through his own choices. Each artificial brother would eventually develop the capacity for independent moral reasoning. Each would begin to question Philip's increasingly extreme plans, and each would ultimately be destroyed when Philip could no longer tolerate the challenge to his worldview. The creation and destruction of multiple Grimwalkers served to further corrupt Philip's already damaged psyche, while also providing him with a continuous source of magical power to fuel his transformation into Emperor Belos. Each destroyed Grimwalker added to his guilt and madness, while also contributing to his supernatural abilities and extended lifespan. As Philip's physical form became increasingly unstable due to his centuries of wild magic consumption, he began to rely more heavily on illusion and misdirection to maintain his human appearance. The persona of Emperor Belos emerged from this need for disguise, a carefully constructed identity that could hide the corruption and madness that lay beneath. The Emperor Belos persona was everything that Philip Witterbane had never been. Confident, charismatic, and possessed of seemingly divine authority. Where Philip was consumed by guilt and self-doubt, Belos projected absolute certainty in his mission. Where Philip was isolated and desperate for connection, Belos commanded the loyalty and fear of countless followers. Where Philip was a failure who had destroyed everything he claimed to love, Belos presented himself as a savior who would deliver the demon realm from corruption. The transition from hidden survivor to public ruler required Philip to develop skills and abilities he had never possessed as a simple human from Gravesfield. He learned to manipulate not only magical forces but also the hearts and minds of the creatures he sought to rule. He became a student of propaganda and political control, mastering techniques for convincing others to act against their own interests while believing they were serving a higher purpose. The development of his plan to establish the Coven system represented the culmination of centuries of preparation and the beginning of his final assault on the wild magic that had tormented him for so long. By convincing the witches and demons of the realm to voluntarily limit their own magical abilities through Coven membership, Philip could achieve through deception what he could never have accomplished through force alone. The genius of the Coven system lay in its ability to disguise oppression as improvement, to frame limitation as liberation, and to convince an entire civilization to participate in its own subjugation. Rather than appearing as a conqueror seeking to destroy their way of life, Philip presented himself as a reformer seeking to perfect it, a savior offering to guide them toward a better future through the wisdom of divine authority. The transformation from Philip Witterbane to Emperor Belos was now complete, though the man beneath the mask remained as broken and corrupted as ever. The centuries of wild magic consumption, guilt, and self-deception had created a being of immense power and terrible purpose, one whose ultimate goal was the destruction of everything beautiful and free in the demon realm. Disguised as an act of salvation and unity, the stage was now set for the conquest of the Boiling Isles and the implementation of a system designed to facilitate the greatest act of genocide in the realm's history. Philip's personal tragedy had metastasized into a threat to every living creature in the demon realm, and the wild magic that had once flowed freely through every branch and stone would soon face its greatest challenge since the death of the Titan itself. The conquest of the Boiling Isles did not happen through a single decisive battle or moment of dramatic revelation, but rather through a campaign of patience, manipulation, and gradual erosion that stretched across decades and relied as much on the willing participation of the conquered as on the power of the conqueror. Philip Witterbane, now fully transformed into the persona of Emperor Belos, understood that lasting control could never be achieved through force alone, but required the far more insidious approach of convincing his subjects that their subjugation was actually their salvation. The demon realm that Belos sought to conquer was vastly different from the primordial paradise that had emerged from the Titan's sacrifice. Millennia of evolution and cultural development had created a complex civilization where wild magic flowed freely through every aspect of daily life, where diversity was celebrated as strength rather than feared as chaos, and where the only limitations on magical expression were those imposed by individual creativity and ethical consideration. This was a world where young witches learned to channel magic through bile sacs that had evolved specifically for that purpose, where demons of every conceivable shape and size contributed their unique abilities to a thriving economy of mutual cooperation, and where the very concept of restricting magical ability based on arbitrary categories would have seemed not only absurd but actively harmful to the health and vitality of their society. The inhabitants of this realm had developed sophisticated institutions of learning, with schools like Hexide Academy serving as centers of magical education that celebrated the full spectrum of magical disciplines. Students were encouraged to explore every branch of magic that interested them, to combine different approaches in creative and innovative ways, and to push the boundaries of what was considered possible through magical means. The economy of the Boiling Isles functioned on principles that would have been incomprehensible to someone from Philip's rigidly hierarchical human background. Value was determined not by the accumulation of material wealth, but by the contribution one made to the collective well-being of the community. A healer who could mend broken bones was valued equally with a construction worker who could reshape stone with earth magic, while artists who could paint with light itself were respected just as highly as farmers who could encourage plants to grow in impossible abundance. This was precisely the kind of free and egalitarian society that Belos's twisted psychology could not tolerate. The sight of creatures living in harmony despite their vast differences, of magic being used for creation rather than destruction, of individuals choosing their own paths without regard for rigid social hierarchies, served as a constant reminder of everything his brother Caleb had found beautiful and everything that Philip had rejected in favor of hatred and control. The first phase of Belos's conquest involved establishing himself as a legitimate authority figure within the existing political and social structure of the realm. This required him to suppress his natural instincts toward violence and domination in favor of a more subtle approach that would allow him to gain power from within the system rather than trying to destroy it from without. He began by positioning himself as a scholar and researcher, someone whose extensive knowledge of magical theory and history made him valuable to the existing educational and political institutions. His centuries of experience in the demon realm, combined with his human outsider's perspective, allowed him to identify weaknesses and inefficiencies in the current system that he could exploit for his own purposes. Belos presented himself as a reformer rather than a revolutionary, someone who wanted to improve and perfect the existing magical civilization, rather than replace it with something entirely different. He spoke eloquently about the need for better organization and coordination among the various magical disciplines, arguing that the current system of unlimited magical freedom was actually holding the realm back from achieving its full potential. The arguments he made were seductive in their apparent reasonableness. Why should healing magic and destruction magic be taught together when they served such different purposes? Wouldn't it make more sense to specialize in particular areas of magical expertise rather than trying to master everything at once? Couldn't the realm achieve greater efficiency and effectiveness by organizing magical practitioners into groups based on their primary areas of focus? These ideas found fertile ground among certain segments of the population who were already dissatisfied with aspects of the current system. Young witches who struggled to master multiple magical disciplines simultaneously were attracted to the idea of being able to focus their studies on areas where they showed natural aptitude. Older practitioners who had achieved mastery in particular fields were flattered by the suggestion that their expertise deserved special recognition and status. The genius of Belos's approach lay in the way he framed these changes, not as limitations but as enhancements, not as restrictions but as opportunities for improvement and specialization. He convinced his audiences that he was offering them something better than what they already had, rather than asking them to give up freedoms they currently enjoyed. The establishment of the Coven system represented the culmination of this careful manipulation and the beginning of the systematic destruction of everything that had made the demon realm unique and beautiful. What appeared on the surface to be a rational reorganization of magical education and practice was actually an elaborate trap designed to strip the realm's inhabitants of their most fundamental freedoms, while convincing them that they were benefiting from the changes. The 9 main covens that formed the core of Belos's system were carefully designed to fragment and isolate the previously unified magical community. The Bard Coven, the Beast-Keeping Coven, the Construction Coven, the Healing Coven, the Illusion Coven, the Oracle Coven, the Plant Coven, the Potions Coven, and the Abomination Coven, each focused on specific aspects of magical practice, while explicitly forbidding their members from practicing any other forms of magic. The psychological impact of this restriction was far more devastating than most of the realm's inhabitants initially realized. Magic in the demon realm had always been understood as a unified force that could be channeled in countless different ways, depending on the needs and creativity of the practitioner. The artificial division of this unified force into separate and mutually exclusive categories created a kind of spiritual amputation that left every coven member fundamentally incomplete. A witch who joined the Healing Coven found herself suddenly unable to use construction magic to build better hospitals, or plant magic to grow medicinal herbs, or illusion magic to comfort patients with soothing visions. The Construction Coven member could no longer use healing magic to treat injuries sustained during dangerous building projects, or oracle magic to predict potential structural weaknesses, or bard magic to coordinate large teams through song. Each coven member had to surrender vast portions of their magical potential in exchange for official recognition and social acceptance within the new system. The process was presented as a coming-of-age ritual, a moment when young witches would choose their destiny and commit to mastering their chosen discipline. But in reality, it was a form of magical lobotomy that permanently crippled the abilities of every participant. The implementation of the coven system required not only the creation of new institutions, but also the systematic dismantling of old ones. Schools like Hexide Academy were gradually restructured to focus on preparing students for coven membership rather than encouraging broad magical exploration. The curriculum was divided into separate tracks that prevented students from learning about magical disciplines outside their intended specialization. Teachers who had previously encouraged their students to experiment with combining different forms of magic were now required to discourage such experimentation as dangerous and counterproductive. The message was clear. Wild magic led to chaos and destruction, while organized magic under proper coven supervision led to prosperity and peace. The propaganda campaign that accompanied these changes was masterful in its manipulation of genuine concerns and aspirations. Belos and his supporters emphasized the safety benefits of magical specialization, pointing to isolated incidents where magical experimentation had led to accidents or injuries. They highlighted the efficiency gains that could be achieved when practitioners focused their efforts on perfecting particular skills rather than spreading themselves too thin across multiple disciplines. They also appealed to the natural human desire for belonging and recognition by framing coven membership as a form of exclusive club or professional organization. Members of each coven were encouraged to take pride in their specialization, to see themselves as part of an elite group of experts, rather than as individuals who had been artificially limited in their abilities. The economic incentives for Coven membership were equally compelling. As the new system became more entrenched, it became increasingly difficult to find employment or social acceptance without official Coven certification. Jobs that had previously been open to anyone with relevant magical abilities now required specific Coven credentials. Housing, healthcare, and educational opportunities were all tied to Coven membership in ways that made resistance increasingly costly and difficult. Perhaps most insidiously, the Coven system created a self-reinforcing cycle of limitation and acceptance. Each generation of young witches grew up knowing only the restricted version of magic that the Coven system allowed. They had no personal experience of the freedom and creativity that wild magic had once made possible, and therefore no sense of what they were being asked to give up. These young witches came to see Coven restrictions not as arbitrary limitations imposed by a tyrant, but as natural and necessary boundaries that had always existed. They were taught that attempting to practice magic outside their designated Coven would be not only illegal but actually dangerous to themselves and others, a form of magical recklessness that responsible witches would never consider. The establishment of Hexide Academy as the primary educational institution under the new system represented a particularly tragic perversion of what had once been a celebration of magical diversity and creativity. The school that had once encouraged students to explore every form of magic that interested them now served as an indoctrination center designed to prepare young minds for willing acceptance of magical limitation. Principal Bump, who had witnessed the transformation of his beloved institution from a place of boundless learning to a factory for producing compliant Coven members, struggled with the moral compromises required by the new system. He understood that open resistance would likely result in his removal and replacement by someone even more willing to enforce Belos's restrictions. But he also knew that his cooperation was enabling the systematic destruction of everything he had dedicated his life to protecting and nurturing. The curriculum at Hexide was restructured around the 9 main Covens, with students required to choose their specialization at increasingly young ages and stick with that choice regardless of changing interests or discoveries about their own magical abilities. The multi-track system that had once allowed students to sample different magical disciplines was gradually phased out in favor of single-track programs that prepared students for membership in specific Covens. Teachers who had previously been valued for their broad knowledge and ability to help students make connections between different forms of magic were now expected to focus exclusively on their designated specializations. Cross-pollination between different magical disciplines was actively discouraged, and students who showed interest in areas outside their chosen track were redirected toward more appropriate subjects. The Emperor's Coven served as the enforcement arm of the new system, an elite organization that stood above and apart from the 9 main Covens and wielded the authority to ensure compliance with Belos's increasingly restrictive regulations. Members of the Emperor's Coven were the only witches permitted to practice multiple forms of magic, a privilege they were granted in exchange for absolute loyalty to Belos and his agenda. This carefully maintained exception to the Coven system's restrictions served several important purposes in maintaining Belos's control over the realm. It provided a powerful incentive for the most talented and ambitious witches to serve the system rather than resist it, offering them access to the magical freedom that everyone else was denied. It also created a clear hierarchy that reinforced the message that unrestricted magic was a privilege to be earned through service to the state rather than a natural right belonging to all magical beings. The Emperor's Coven members became the visible enforcers of magical restriction throughout the realm, investigating reports of wild magic use, arresting practitioners who operated outside the Coven system, and generally serving as a reminder that the old freedoms had been permanently revoked in favor of the new order. Lilith Clawthorn's eventual rise to the position of head of the Emperor's Coven represented one of the system's greatest propaganda victories. Here was someone who had grown up during the transition from wild magic to the Coven system, who had experienced both forms of magical practice and chosen to embrace the new restrictions voluntarily rather than being forced into compliance. Lilith's journey from wild magic practitioner to Coven enforcer illustrated the way that Belos's system could corrupt even fundamentally good people by appealing to their desires for recognition, belonging, and the opportunity to make a positive difference in the world. Her genuine belief that she was serving the greater good by enforcing magical restrictions made her far more effective as a propaganda tool than any number of purely opportunistic collaborators could have been. The personal tragedy of Lilith's transformation was compounded by the way it drove a wedge between her and her sister Ida, who had refused to accept Coven membership and had instead chosen the dangerous path of resistance and rebellion. The conflict between the two sisters became a microcosm of the larger conflict between the old way of wild magic freedom and the new way of organized magical restriction. The resistance movements that emerged in response to the Coven system were brave but ultimately doomed efforts that served more to legitimize Belos's authority than to challenge it effectively. These scattered groups of wild magic practitioners, led by figures like Rain Whispers and the other members of the Bards Against the Throne, lacked the organization and resources necessary to mount a serious challenge to the increasingly entrenched Coven system. Belos's response to these resistance movements was calculated to serve his propaganda purposes as well as his security concerns. Rather than simply crushing the rebels through overwhelming force, he allowed them to operate just long enough to create dramatic examples of the chaos and danger that wild magic supposedly represented. When resistance operations failed or caused collateral damage, Belos's propaganda machine was ready to point to these incidents as proof that unrestricted magic was inherently dangerous, and that the Coven system was necessary to protect innocent citizens from the recklessness of magical extremists. When resistance members were captured, their public trials and punishments served as warning to anyone else who might consider challenging the established order. The systematic destruction of wild magic knowledge represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of Belos's campaign of cultural genocide. Ancient texts that described magical techniques outside the approved Coven specializations were confiscated and destroyed, while new educational materials were created that presented the Coven system as the natural and inevitable evolution of magical practice, rather than an artificial restriction imposed by authoritarian control. Libraries and archives that had preserved the accumulated wisdom of millennia were purged of any materials that might inspire students to question the limitations imposed by Coven membership. Scholars who attempted to preserve or study forbidden magical knowledge faced persecution and imprisonment, while those who cooperated with the new restrictions were rewarded with positions of authority within the restructured educational system. The long-term psychological effects of this cultural destruction were devastating in ways that would not become fully apparent until generations had passed. The collective memory of magical freedom was systematically erased, replaced by artificial memories of chaos and danger that justified the need for permanent restriction and control. Young witches who came of age entirely within the Coven system had no frame of reference for understanding what had been lost, no way to imagine alternatives to the limitations they had been taught to accept as natural and necessary. They became willing participants in their own oppression, defending the system that restricted them against anyone who suggested that things could or should be different. The transformation of the demon realm from a society of wild magic freedom to a totalitarian state organized around magical restriction took several decades to complete, but by the time Luz Noseda would eventually arrive in the Boiling Isles, the process had become so thoroughly entrenched that most inhabitants could no longer imagine any alternative way of organizing their society. The Coven system had achieved its intended purpose of fragmenting and weakening the magical community while convincing most of its victims that their oppression was actually their protection. The stage was now set for the final phase of Belos's plan, the Day of Unity, that would use the very system of magical restriction he had created as the mechanism for the complete destruction of everyone he claimed to be saving. The Clawthorne family name carried within it the weight of centuries, a legacy that stretched back through countless generations of witches who had lived and died by the principle that magic was meant to flow wild and free through every corner of existence. Long before the rise of Emperor Belos and his systematic campaign to cage the very forces that gave life meaning, the Clawthorns had served as guardians of ancient wisdom, keepers of magical traditions that celebrated the boundless creativity and infinite potential that wild magic represented. The family tree that grew from these deep roots was as diverse and unpredictable as the magic they cherished, producing individuals whose personalities and abilities defied easy categorization or simple understanding. Some Clawthorns became scholars who dedicated their lives to preserving the accumulated knowledge of their ancestors, while others embraced the role of rebel and revolutionary, challenging any authority that dared to suggest limits on magical expression. What united them across the generations was not any particular set of beliefs or practices, but rather a shared commitment to the fundamental principle that magic should serve life, creativity, and freedom, rather than being enslaved to the narrow ambitions of those who feared its power. Ida Clawthorne, who would eventually become known throughout the Boiling Isles as the Owl Lady, was born into this legacy of magical rebellion during a time when the old ways were still strong enough to provide some protection against the growing influence of those who sought to impose order and restriction on the wild chaos of calm, magical existence. Her childhood was spent in the company of creatures and practitioners who understood magic not as a tool to be wielded, but as a living force to be partnered with, not as a resource to be hoarded, but as a gift to be shared freely with anyone willing to approach it with proper respect and wonder. From her earliest moments of consciousness, Ida displayed the kind of raw magical talent that appears perhaps once in a generation, abilities that seem to flow from some inexhaustible well of creative energy deep within her soul. Where other young witches struggled to master individual spells or techniques, Ida demonstrated an intuitive understanding of magical principles that allowed her to improvise solutions to problems that had never been encountered before, to combine different forms of magic in ways that theoretically should have been impossible, and to push the boundaries of what anyone believed could be accomplished through magical means. Her sister Lilith, 2 years older and possessed of a very different temperament, represented another facet of the Clawthorne magical heritage. Where Ida was wild and unpredictable, Lilith was methodical and disciplined. Where Ida relied on instinct and creativity, Lilith preferred careful study and systematic approach to magical learning. Where Ida saw rules as suggestions to be tested and boundaries as challenges to be overcome, Lilith found comfort in structure and took pride in mastering established techniques before attempting to develop new ones. The relationship between the two sisters during their childhood was one of constant challenge and mutual inspiration, each pushing the other to achieve greater heights, while also serving as a check against the particular excesses that their different temperaments might have led them toward. Ida's wild creativity was tempered by Lilith's careful analysis, while Lilith's tendency toward rigid thinking was constantly disrupted by Ida's innovative approaches and willingness to take risks that more cautious practitioners would never consider. Their parents, themselves accomplished practitioners of wild magic, recognized that their daughters represented two equally valid but fundamentally different approaches to magical development, and made the wise decision to encourage both rather than trying to force either child into a mold that would have stifled their natural talents. This early acceptance and nurturing of their individual differences would prove to be one of the most important factors in shaping both sisters' eventual destinies, though the paths those destinies would take would lead them in directions that neither parent could have anticipated. The education that both sisters received was grounded in the ancient clawthorn tradition of treating magic as a unified force that could manifest in countless different ways depending on the needs and creativity of the practitioner. They learned to work with plants and animals, to manipulate the elements, to peer into possible futures and distant places, to heal injuries and illnesses, and to defend themselves and others against any threat that might arise. But more importantly, they learned to approach all these different manifestations of magic as aspects of a single, coherent whole, rather than as separate and unrelated disciplines. This holistic approach to magical education stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly popular theories being promoted by certain reform-minded educators, who argued that magical learning would be more efficient if students focused their efforts on mastering particular specializations rather than trying to develop competence across multiple areas. The Clawthorne family tradition held that such specialization was not only unnecessary but actively harmful, creating artificial divisions in what should be understood as a seamless unity of creative force. Ida's natural rebelliousness manifested even during these early years of magical education, as she consistently pushed against the boundaries of what her teachers considered safe or appropriate for someone of her age and experience level. She would experiment with spell combinations that had never been attempted before, seek out ancient texts that described dangerous and unpredictable magical techniques, and generally approach her studies with an enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on recklessness but always demonstrated genuine respect for the power she was learning to channel. The first signs of the curse that would eventually transform Ida's life appeared during her teenage years, though at the time neither she nor anyone around her understood what was happening or recognized the symptoms for what they truly were. The strange episodes began as brief moments of disorientation and memory loss, periods when Ida would find herself in unfamiliar locations with no clear recollection of how she had gotten there or what she had been doing immediately before the blackout occurred. These episodes were initially dismissed as the normal growing pains that many young witches experienced as their magical abilities developed and stabilized during adolescence. Ida's parents and teachers assumed that her particularly strong magical potential was simply requiring more time and energy to fully integrate into her developing personality, and that the temporary confusion and memory gaps would resolve themselves naturally as she matured. However, the episodes gradually became more frequent and more severe, evolving from brief moments of confusion into longer periods during which Ida seemed to become a completely different person. During these transformations, she would display levels of aggression and hostility that were completely foreign to her normal personality, attacking friends and family members with a viciousness that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal that had nothing to do with her conscious mind or deliberate intentions. The physical changes that accompanied these psychological transformations were even more disturbing than the personality alterations. Ida's body would begin to take on characteristics that seemed more animal than human, with elongated limbs, sharpened claws, and an overall appearance that suggested she was somehow reverting to a more primitive and feral state of being. Her magic during these episodes became similarly wild and uncontrolled, lashing out in all directions without regard for friend or foe, safety or consequences. The mystery of what was causing these transformations would not be solved for many years, and the truth, when it was finally revealed, would prove to be far more tragic and personal than anyone could have imagined. For now, Ida and her family were forced to develop coping strategies and protective measures that would allow them to manage the curse's effects without understanding its true nature or origins. Lilith's response to her sister's mysterious affliction was characteristic of her methodical and research-oriented approach to problem-solving. She threw herself into studying every available text on magical curses, transformative disorders, and similar conditions, determined to find some explanation for what was happening to Ida, and hopefully discover a cure or treatment that could restore her sister to full health and normal function. This research brought Lilith into contact with some of the most advanced magical scholars and practitioners in the realm, experts who had dedicated their lives to understanding the darker and more dangerous aspects of magical practice. Through these connections, she began to learn about the growing movement toward magical reform and organization that was being promoted by the mysterious figure who called himself Emperor Belos. The arguments that Belos and his supporters made about the need for better control and organization of magical practice resonated strongly with Lilith's orderly mind, and her growing fear that uncontrolled magic was somehow responsible for her sister's condition. If wild magic could cause such devastating transformations in someone as talented and experienced as Ida, perhaps the reformers were right to argue that unlimited magical freedom was simply too dangerous to continue tolerating. Ida's own response to her curse was characteristically different from her sister's scholarly approach. Rather than retreating into research and theory, she threw herself even more fully into the practice of wild magic, as if she could somehow overcome the curse's effects through sheer force of will and creative application of magical energy. This approach was both admirably courageous and tragically counterproductive, as the increased magical activity often seemed to trigger more frequent and more severe episodes of transformation. The relationship between the two sisters began to strain under the pressure of Ida's worsening condition and their fundamentally different approaches to dealing with the crisis. Lilith's increasing involvement with the magical reform movement put her at odds with Ida's commitment to wild magic freedom, while Ida's refusal to accept any limitations on her magical practice frustrated Lilith's desire to protect her sister from the consequences of her own recklessness. The growing influence of Emperor Belos and his coven system created additional pressure on both sisters to make choices about their future that would define not only their own destinies, but also their relationship with each other. Lilith found herself increasingly drawn to the promise of order and safety that the coven system seemed to offer, while Ida became more and more determined to resist any attempt to limit or control her magical expression. The friendship that Ida developed with Rain Whispers during their shared time at Hexside Academy represented one of the few bright spots in an otherwise increasingly dark and complicated period of her life. Rain's gentle nature and musical approach to magic provided a perfect complement to Ida's more aggressive and experimental style, while their shared commitment to wild magic freedom created a bond that transcended the casual friendships that most students formed during their academic careers. The relationship between Ida and Rain evolved over time, from friendship to something deeper and more romantic, though both were too young and too focused on their magical studies to fully understand or act upon the feelings they were developing for each other. They spent countless hours together practicing and experimenting with different forms of magic, combining Rain's melodic approach with Ida's innovative techniques to create entirely new forms of magical expression that neither could have achieved working alone. Their collaboration was particularly successful in the area of bardic magic, where Rain's natural musical talent provided the foundation for spells and enchantments that Ida could then modify and amplify through her own wild magic abilities. Together, they developed techniques that could soothe the most savage beasts, inspire courage in the most fearful hearts, and create illusions of such beauty and complexity that they seemed to exist in dimensions beyond the merely visual or auditory. The curse episodes that continued to plague Ida during this period put considerable strain on her relationship with Rain, though not in the way that might have been expected. Rather than being frightened or repulsed by Ida's transformations, Rain demonstrated a compassion and loyalty that proved their feelings were based on something far deeper than mere physical attraction or casual affection. They worked tirelessly to help Ida find ways to predict and manage her episodes, offering support and assistance without judgment or expectation. However, the curse also created barriers between them that proved increasingly difficult to overcome. Ida's fear of hurting someone she cared about during one of her transformations led her to become more withdrawn and reluctant to allow their relationship to develop into the deeper commitment that both of them desired. She began to convince herself that she was too dangerous to be close to anyone, that the curse made her a threat to everyone around her regardless of her conscious intentions or feelings. The graduation from Hexside that should have been a celebration of achievement and a launching point for their adult lives instead became a moment of painful separation and difficult choices. Lilith had already begun making connections with the Emperor's Coven and was clearly planning to pursue a career within Belos's rapidly expanding system of magical control and organization. Ida, despite the ongoing challenges posed by her curse, remained committed to the path of wild magic freedom and resistance to any form of external limitation or control. Rain found themselves caught between their loyalty to Ida and their own growing awareness that the magical world they had grown up in was changing in ways that might make their old dreams and plans impossible to achieve. The bardic magic they had mastered together was already being viewed with suspicion by the authorities as a potentially dangerous form of wild magic that could be used to manipulate and control others without their knowledge or consent. The decision to go their separate ways after graduation was made reluctantly and with considerable pain by all parties involved. Ida chose the path of complete independence, determined to live according to her own principles, regardless of the personal cost or social consequences. She began the process of establishing herself as a wild witch who operated completely outside the increasingly restrictive coven system, accepting the outlaw status that such a choice inevitably entailed. Lilith's path led her deeper into the world of official magical practice and eventually to a position within the Emperor's Coven hierarchy. Her scholarly approach to magic and her genuine desire to help create a more orderly and safe magical world made her valuable to Belos's organization, while her family connection to one of the realm's most notorious wild witches provided her with insider knowledge that proved useful in tracking and apprehending other magical rebels. Rain chose a middle path that attempted to preserve their commitment to musical magic while working within the constraints imposed by the new coven system. They joined the Bard Coven and began building a career as an officially sanctioned magical practitioner, though they never abandoned their hope that someday they might find a way to reunite with Ida and resume the collaboration that had been one of the most meaningful aspects of their youth. The Owl House that would eventually become Ida's permanent residence and the center of her operations as the most wanted criminal in the Boiling Isles was not originally intended to serve such a dramatic purpose. The structure had been built generations earlier by another member of the Clawthorne family as a simple retreat and workshop, a place where magical practitioners could experiment with new techniques away from the prying eyes of neighbors and authorities who might not appreciate the noise, mess, and occasional explosions that such work inevitably generated. The house itself was a reflection of the wild magic principles that had guided its construction, with rooms that rearranged themselves according to the needs and moods of their occupants, corridors that led to different destinations depending on the time of day or the intentions of the person walking through them, and an overall architecture that seemed to defy conventional understanding of how buildings were supposed to be designed and constructed. The magical properties of the house made it an ideal refuge for someone living outside the law and needing to avoid detection by the authorities. The structure could camouflage itself to blend in with its surroundings, redirect the attention of unwanted visitors, and even relocate itself to different locations when the need arose. These defensive capabilities, combined with its remote location in the forest outside the main population centers, provided Ida with the security and privacy she needed to continue practicing wild magic despite the increasing penalties for such activities. The discovery of King represented one of the most significant turning points in Ida's adult life. Though she would not fully understand the implications of this encounter until much later. The tiny creature she found imprisoned in the ruins of an ancient castle appeared to be nothing more than a small demon with delusions of grandeur, convinced that he was the rightful ruler of the demon realm. Despite his obvious helplessness and lack of any apparent magical abilities, Ida's decision to rescue King and bring him back to the Owl House was motivated initially by simple compassion and perhaps a touch of amusement at his grandiose claims and imperious attitude. She had always been drawn to outcasts and misfits, creatures who did not fit easily into the established social categories, and who struggled to find acceptance in a world that valued conformity over individuality. The relationship that developed between Ida and King over the years that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. For Ida, King provided the companionship and emotional connection that she had been denying herself since her separation from Rain and the deterioration of her relationship with Lilith. The little creature's unwavering loyalty and affection helped to heal wounds that she had not even fully acknowledged were still bleeding. For King, Ida represented the first person who had ever treated him with genuine kindness and respect, accepting his claims to royal status without mockery, while also providing the practical care and protection that he desperately needed. The family bond that grew between them was based not on blood or formal adoption, but on mutual choice and daily acts of love and support that created ties stronger than any biological relationship. The Owl House became not just a physical refuge, but an emotional sanctuary where both Ida and King could be themselves without fear of judgment or rejection. The house's magical properties seemed to respond to the genuine affection and mutual support that characterized their relationship, creating spaces that perfectly accommodated both their individual needs and their shared life together. Ida's activities as the most wanted criminal in the Boiling Isles were driven not by simple lawlessness or antisocial tendencies, but by a principled commitment to preserving and protecting the wild magic traditions that the Coven system was systematically destroying. She became a smuggler and black market dealer, not for personal profit, but to ensure that magical knowledge and artifacts that would otherwise be confiscated and destroyed could continue to circulate among those who appreciated their true value. Her criminal operations were carefully planned and executed with a combination of magical skill, creative problem-solving, and sheer audacity that made her legendary among both the authorities who hunted her and the underground community that depended on her services. She specialized in acquiring and redistributing magical items that had been banned under the Coven system, from ancient spellbooks and potion ingredients to artifacts that could enhance magical abilities beyond the limitations imposed by Coven membership. The persona of the Owl Lady that Ida cultivated as part of her criminal activities was both a practical disguise and a form of psychological armor that allowed her to operate in dangerous situations without being paralyzed by fear or doubt. The confident, irreverent, and slightly manic personality she presented to the world helped to mask the pain and loneliness that she carried as a result of her curse and her isolation from mainstream magical society. However, this persona also served to distance her from potential friends and allies who might have provided emotional support and practical assistance if she had been willing to show them her more vulnerable side. The walls she built to protect herself from the consequences of her curse also prevented her from forming the deeper connections that might have helped her bear the burden of her condition more easily. The reputation that Ida acquired as the most powerful wild witch in the Boiling Isles was both a source of pride and a constant source of danger. Her legendary magical abilities made her valuable to other rebels and outcasts who needed her help, but they also made her a high-priority target for the Emperor's Coven and other authorities who saw her as a threat to the stability of their carefully constructed system of magical control. The ongoing conflict between Ida and Lilith that developed over the years following their graduation from Hexside was one of the most tragic aspects of the Coven system's impact on the realm's inhabitants. The two sisters, who had once pushed each other to achieve greater heights, were now trapped in a cycle of pursuit and evasion that caused pain to both while serving the interests of neither. Lilith's position as head of the Emperor's Coven made her personally responsible for capturing her sister, a duty that she approached with growing reluctance and internal conflict as the years passed. She convinced herself that arresting Ida would ultimately be for her sister's own good, that bringing her into the Coven system would provide her with the support and structure she needed to manage her curse and find stability in her life. Ida, for her part, saw Lilith's involvement with the Emperor's Coven as a fundamental betrayal of everything their family had taught them about the importance of magical freedom. She could not understand how her sister could willingly serve a system that was dedicated to destroying the very traditions that had shaped their childhood and given meaning to their shared heritage. The personal dimension of their conflict was complicated by the professional requirements of their respective positions. Lilith could not simply ignore her sister's criminal activities without undermining her own authority and credibility within the Emperor's Coven, while Ida could not moderate her resistance activities without abandoning the principles and people who depended on her continued defiance of the Coven system. The curse that continued to plague Ida throughout her adult life remained a constant source of fear and uncertainty, casting a shadow over every relationship and every activity she pursued. The episodes were unpredictable in their timing and severity, making it impossible for her to plan her life around them or develop reliable coping strategies that could minimize their impact. The physical transformations that accompanied each episode were becoming more severe and more permanent as the years passed, leaving lasting changes to Ida's body that served as constant reminders of the curse's growing power over her. Her hair began to show streaks of grey that had nothing to do with normal aging, while her overall physical condition showed signs of the supernatural strain that the repeated transformations were placing on her system. The emotional and psychological effects of living with such a condition were perhaps even more devastating than the physical symptoms. Ida lived in constant fear of what she might do during her next episode, haunted by fragmented memories of violence and destruction that she could not clearly recall but could not completely forget. The uncertainty about when the curse might strike next made it difficult for her to form long-term plans or commitments, contributing to her growing isolation from the magical community she had once been so deeply connected to. The discovery of potions and treatments that could temporarily suppress the curse's effects provided some relief, but these solutions came with their own costs and limitations. The elixirs that Ida used to maintain her normal form required rare and expensive ingredients that were difficult to obtain through legitimate channels, forcing her to rely on her criminal network to maintain her supply. The temporary nature of these treatments also meant that she was constantly aware of how much time she had before her next dose would be needed, adding another layer of stress and uncertainty to her already complicated existence. Despite all these challenges and hardships, Ida's commitment to wild magic and resistance to the Coven system never wavered. She understood herself to be one of the last guardians of ancient traditions that would be completely lost if she and others like her did not continue to practice and preserve them despite the personal costs involved. The Owl House became not just her refuge, but a repository of magical knowledge and artifacts that would be invaluable to future generations who might someday seek to restore the freedom that was being systematically destroyed. The daily routine that Ida and King established at the Owl House reflected their shared commitment to maintaining their independence and their connection to the wild magic traditions that the Coven system sought to eliminate. Their days were filled with magical experiments and practice sessions, smuggling operations and black market transactions, research into curse remedies, and preservation of forbidden knowledge, all carried out within the protective embrace of a house that had become a symbol of resistance to everything that Emperor Belos represented. Luz Nocida's life in the human realm of Gravesfield had been defined by a fundamental disconnection between who she was and who the world expected her to be, a gulf that seemed to widen with each passing year, as she struggled to fit herself into spaces that had never been designed to accommodate someone of her particular combination of curiosity, creativity, and stubborn refusal to accept that the ordinary was all there was to existence. She was a dreamer in a world that valued conformity, an artist in a system that rewarded standardization, a seeker of magic in a realm that had convinced itself that wonder was something to be outgrown rather than cultivated. Her mother, Camila, watched with growing concern as her daughter's attempts to connect with her peers consistently ended in confusion, rejection, and sometimes outright hostility from classmates who could not understand why anyone would choose to be different when being the same was so much easier and safer. Luz's tendency to approach every situation with enthusiasm and unconventional solutions made her a target for those who had learned that standing out was dangerous, while her genuine kindness and desire to help others was often misinterpreted as attention-seeking or showing off. The incident with the snakes at school represented the culmination of years of mounting frustration and miscommunication between Luz and the educational system that was supposed to be preparing her for productive adult life. Her attempt to create an elaborate presentation that would engage her classmates and share her love of fantasy literature had instead resulted in chaos, panic, and administrative concern about her judgment and social adjustment. The fireworks, the live snakes, the theatrical costumes, and the passionate delivery that Luz had hoped would inspire wonder instead created fear and reinforced the growing consensus that she needed professional help to learn appropriate social behavior. The summer camp that Camila arranged was presented as an opportunity for personal growth and social skill development, but Luz understood it for what it truly was. An attempt to sand away all the rough edges that made her unique and transform her into someone more acceptable to a world that had no patience for nonconformity. The brochures promised to help campers develop realistic expectations and practical life skills, code words that meant crushing imagination and accepting limitations that Luz had never believed were real or necessary. The conflict between mother and daughter over this decision was particularly painful because it arose from genuine love and concern on both sides. Camila wanted to protect her daughter from the loneliness and rejection that seemed to follow her wherever she went, while Luz wanted to hold on to the parts of herself that made life worth living even if they made social interaction more difficult. Neither understood that they were both right and both wrong, that the world needed to change to accommodate people like Luz just as much as Luz needed to learn how to navigate a world that was not yet ready for her particular brand of magic. The morning when everything changed began like countless others, with Luz reluctantly preparing to take the first step toward becoming someone she did not want to be. The summer camp intake process loomed ahead of her like a gateway to a prison of normalcy, while the fantasy novel clutched in her hands represented the last vestige of a world where heroes could triumph through creativity and determination rather than conformity and compromise. She had no way of knowing that this particular book would serve as the key to unlocking everything she had ever dreamed of finding. The owl that snatched her book appeared so suddenly and moved so quickly that Luz barely had time to register what was happening before her instincts took over, and she found herself in pursuit of the creature across unfamiliar territory. The chase led her away from the camp, away from the safe and predictable path that had been mapped out for her future, and toward a door that should not have existed in any rational universe, but nevertheless stood before her like an answer to prayers she had been afraid to voice. The portal door appeared to be nothing more than an abandoned structure in the middle of the woods, the kind of debris that accumulated in forgotten places where human activity had once flourished and then retreated. But the owl that had taken her book flew directly through what should have been solid wood, disappearing in a flash of light that suggested depths and dimensions beyond anything that conventional architecture could contain. The choice that faced Luz in that moment was as simple as it was profound. Accept the loss of her book and return to the world of limitations and expectations, or step through the impossible doorway and discover what lay on the other side. The decision, when it came, felt less like choosing and more like falling, as if some fundamental force of gravity was pulling her toward a destiny that had been waiting for her arrival since long before she was born. The sensation of stepping through the portal was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a moment of dissolution and reconstitution that left her feeling simultaneously more and less herself than she had ever been before. The world that revealed itself on the other side of the portal door defied every assumption she had ever made about the nature of reality and the boundaries of what was possible. The boiling isles spread out before her like a living illustration from the fantasy novels she cherished, but with a vibrancy and authenticity that no human artist could have captured. The sky burned with colors that had no names in any human language, while the landscape itself seemed to pulse with magical energy that made every breath feel like drinking liquid starlight. The creatures that inhabited this realm were unlike anything from her books or imagination, beings that combined familiar animal characteristics with impossible magical properties in ways that created entirely new categories of existence. She saw demons that walked on two legs and spoke in perfectly comprehensible language, witches who flew through the air on wooden staffs as easily as humans walked on solid ground, and magical phenomena that transformed the mundane laws of physics into suggestions rather than requirements. The first person she encountered in this strange new world was Ida Clawthorne, though at the time Luz had no understanding of who the Owl Lady was or what role she would come to play in her life. To Luz, Ida appeared to be exactly the kind of character she had always hoped to meet in her fantasy novels. Powerful, confident, operating outside conventional, social rules, and possessed of a casual attitude toward authority that suggested limitless possibilities for adventure and discovery. Ida's reaction to finding a human in the demon realm was a mixture of surprise, amusement, and calculation. Humans were not unknown in this world, but they were rare enough to be valuable commodities in certain markets. And Ida's first instinct was to consider the profit potential of her unexpected discovery. However, something about Luz's obvious wonder and genuine excitement at finding herself in a magical realm reminded Ida of feelings she had thought were lost forever, memories of what it had been like to discover magic for the first time, and to believe that anything was possible. The negotiation that followed was characteristic of both participants. Luz's immediate assumption that she had found a mentor who could teach her magic, and Ida's practical assessment of what the enthusiastic human might be able to offer in exchange for guidance and protection. The arrangement they reached was mutually beneficial in ways that neither fully understood at the time, with Luz providing assistance with Ida's various schemes and enterprises, while receiving informal education in the principles and practices of magic as it existed in the demon realm. King's reaction to the arrival of a human in his domain was typically grandiose and completely ineffective. His attempts to assert royal authority over the newcomer were undercut by his obvious helplessness and dependence on Ida for even the most basic necessities of daily life. However, Luz's immediate acceptance of his claims to nobility and her willingness to treat him with the respect he demanded created an instant bond that transcended the obvious differences in their species and backgrounds. The dynamic that developed between Luz, Edda, and King represented a form of found family that none of them had experienced before. Luz finally had the magical mentors she had always dreamed of finding, while Ida and King discovered that having someone around who appreciated their unique qualities without judgment or expectation created a warmth and stability that had been missing from their lives for longer than either cared to remember. The Owl House itself seemed to welcome Luz's presence, its magical properties adapting to accommodate her needs and preferences in ways that made her feel more at home than she had ever felt in the human realm. The building's tendency to rearrange itself according to the desires and necessities of its inhabitants created spaces perfectly suited to her various projects and interests, while the general atmosphere of creative chaos that permeated the structure matched her own approach to life and learning. The discovery that she could not naturally perform magic in the same way as witches and demons was initially devastating to Luz, representing the first major obstacle to her assumption that she could simply transplant herself into this magical world and immediately become the hero of her own adventure story. The biological requirement for bile sacs to channel magical energy meant that her human physiology was fundamentally incompatible with the standard methods of magical practice that everyone around her took for granted. However, this apparent limitation became the catalyst for one of the most significant magical discoveries in generations. When Luz stumbled upon the ancient practice of glyph magic during her exploration of the ruins that dotted the landscape of the Kreis, Boiling Isles, the symbols carved into ancient stones and preserved in forgotten texts represented a form of magical expression that predated the evolution of bile sacs and worked by directly channeling the wild magic that flowed through the demon realm itself. The light glyph that became her first successful magical spell was more than just a practical tool for illumination. It represented proof that magic was not limited to those born with specific biological adaptations, but could be accessed by anyone willing to learn the proper methods and approach the forces involved with appropriate respect and understanding. The simple act of drawing a circle with radiating lines and tapping it to create magical light opened up possibilities that had been considered permanently closed for thousands of years. Ida's recognition of what Luz had accomplished sent shockwaves through her understanding of magical theory and history. The glyph magic that the human had rediscovered was not some primitive precursor to modern magical practice, but rather a more fundamental and universal approach to channeling magical energy that had been largely forgotten in favor of the Rund, more convenient but more limited bile sac method. This discovery had implications that extended far beyond Luz's personal situation. If glyph magic could allow humans to perform magic, it might also provide a way for witches whose bile sacs had been damaged or whose magical abilities had been artificially restricted to regain access to their full potential. The political and social ramifications of such a possibility were staggering, particularly in a world where magical limitation was enforced through the coven system as a means of population control. The education that Luz received at the Owl House was unlike anything that had ever been offered at Hexside Academy or any other official magical institution. Rather than being forced to choose a single specialization and abandon all other forms of magical expression, she was encouraged to experiment with every aspect of magic that interested her, and to combine different approaches in whatever ways proved most effective or satisfying. The ice glyph that she discovered next added elemental control to her growing repertoire of magical abilities, while the plant glyph connected her to the life force that flowed through all living things in the demon realm. Each new glyph she mastered opened up additional possibilities for magical combination and creativity, allowing her to develop spell combinations that would have been impossible for practitioners limited to single coven specializations. The wind glyph that completed her basic elemental arsenal gave her access to forces of motion and change that could be used for everything from simple transportation to complex atmospheric manipulation. More importantly, the pattern of discovery that emerged from her glyph research suggested that there were potentially infinite variations and combinations possible within this ancient magical system, limited only by the practitioner's creativity and understanding. The decision to enroll Luz at Hexide Academy represented a significant shift in Ida's approach to her unofficial apprentice's education. Despite her own negative experiences with institutional magical education and her philosophical opposition to the Coven system, Ida recognized that Luz needed exposure to structured learning and social interaction with peers her own age if she was going to develop into a well-rounded magical practitioner. The challenge of getting Luz accepted at Hexide required considerable deception and rule-bending, as the school's policies were not designed to accommodate humans or practitioners of wild magic. The false identification and paperwork that Ida provided represented a significant risk for both of them, as discovery would result in serious consequences for everyone involved in the fraud. Principal Bump's initial reaction to Luz's unusual background and magical methods reflected the institutional bias toward conformity and specialization that characterized the entire educational system under Belos's influence. Her inability to demonstrate magic through conventional bile sac channeling marked her as either a fraud or some kind of magical anomaly that did not fit into the established categories and procedures that govern student placement and curriculum design. However, Luz's demonstration of glyph magic during her placement evaluation created a crisis that forced the school administration to confront questions they had never needed to consider before. Here was a student who could clearly perform magic, but through methods that predated and potentially superseded the entire theoretical framework upon which modern magical education was based. The decision to allow Luz to attend multiple track classes simultaneously was unprecedented and represented a significant compromise between her needs and the school's policies. While she was not permitted to officially study every form of magic that interested her, the informal arrangement that developed allowed her to gain exposure to different magical disciplines while maintaining the fiction that she was still working toward eventual coven specialization. The friendships that Luz formed with Willow Park and Gus Porter represented her first successful peer relationships in either realm and provided her with the social connection and emotional support that had been missing from her life in Gravesfield. Both of her new friends were themselves outsiders within the Hexide social hierarchy, making them natural allies for someone whose entire existence challenged the established order. Willow's struggles with her assigned track placement reflected the arbitrary and destructive nature of the Coven system's approach to magical education. Her natural talents lay in plant magic, but family pressure and social expectations had forced her into the abomination track, where her abilities were not only underutilized, but actively suppressed. The friendship with Luz provided her with the encouragement and support she needed to embrace her true magical identity and challenge the limitations that others had imposed upon her. Gus's youth and academic advancement had left him socially isolated despite his obvious intelligence and magical talent. His fascination with human culture made him uniquely positioned to appreciate Luz's perspective and experiences, while his knowledge of illusion magic complemented her growing collection of glyph-based abilities in ways that enhanced both of their magical development. The relationship that developed between Luz and Amity Blight was more complex and took longer to evolve into genuine friendship due to the significant differences in their backgrounds and initial attitudes toward magic and social hierarchy. Amity's position as one of Hexide's top students and her family's prominent status within the established order made her initially suspicious of anyone who challenged conventional approaches to magical learning. However, Luz's genuine kindness, determination, and willingness to see the best in everyone eventually broke through Amity's defensive barriers and revealed the insecurities and pressures that lay beneath her perfect student facade. The discovery that Amity was not naturally superior, but had achieved her success through tremendous effort and personal sacrifice, created a foundation for mutual understanding and respect. The impact that Luz had on Hexide Academy extended far beyond her own personal friendships and academic achievements. Her presence as a human who could perform magic through ancient methods challenged many of the fundamental assumptions that both students and faculty had been taught to accept as unchangeable facts about the nature of magical ability and potential. Students who had been struggling within their assigned tracks began to question whether their difficulties were due to personal inadequacy or systemic problems with the specialization requirements. Teachers who had been enforcing restrictions they privately disagreed with found themselves re-evaluating their own roles in perpetuating a system that seemed designed to limit rather than enhance their students' magical development. The glyph magic that Luz practiced became a subject of intense curiosity and secret study among students who recognized its potential to bypass the limitations imposed by Coven membership. While few were brave enough to openly challenge the established system, many began quietly experimenting with the symbol-based approach to magic that Luz had rediscovered. The connection between Luz's glyph magic and the ancient history of the demon realm gradually became clearer as she continued her studies and explorations. The symbols she was learning to use were not arbitrary inventions, but rather representations of fundamental forces and principles that had governed magical practice since the earliest days of the realm's existence. The ruins scattered throughout the Boiling Isles contained evidence of a magical civilization that had existed long before the development of Bilesac magic and the establishment of the Coven system. These ancient practitioners had worked with wild magic in ways that were both more sophisticated and more harmonious than anything achieved by the current generation of magical practitioners. The Titan's influence on glyph magic became apparent as Luz's abilities developed and her understanding deepened. The symbols she was learning to draw were not just abstract representations, but actual communication with the consciousness that still resided within the realm itself. Each glyph was a word in a language that the Titan had created to allow all forms of life to access the magical energy that flowed from its sacrifice. The discovery that she was essentially learning to speak directly with the Titan added profound spiritual and philosophical dimensions to Luz's magical education. She was not just mastering techniques, but developing a relationship with the fundamental creative force that had made the demon realm possible in the first place. The political implications of Luz's presence and abilities in the demon realm were slow to manifest, but potentially revolutionary in their scope. A human who could perform magic through methods that predated and potentially superseded the entire Coven system represented a challenge to Emperor Belos's authority that went to the very heart of his claims about the necessity and inevitability of magical restriction. The Emperor's Coven's growing awareness of Luz's activities and capabilities created pressure for action that would eventually force a direct confrontation between the forces of freedom and control that had been building tension throughout the realm for decades. Her very existence as a successful practitioner of wild magic undermined the propaganda that had convinced most of the population to accept limitations on their own magical potential. The found family that developed around Luz, Ida, And King represented more than just personal relationships, but also a model for how different forms of life could coexist and support each other, without the artificial hierarchies and restrictions that characterized the official social order. Their household became a demonstration that diversity and freedom could create stability and happiness more effectively than conformity and control. The daily life at the Owl House provided Luz with the sense of belonging and purpose that had been missing from her existence in the human realm, while also giving her the practical education in magical theory and application that would prove essential in the challenges that lay ahead. Each day brought new discoveries about herself, about magic, and about the complex history of the realm she was slowly beginning to think of as home. The collector existed in dimensions that predated the formation of individual consciousness, in spaces between spaces where the very concepts of time and identity held different meanings than they would ever possess in the material realms that smaller beings called home. They were among the first entities to emerge from the primordial chaos that preceded all organized reality, consciousness, given form and purpose, in an era when the universe itself was still learning the difference between existence and void, between something and nothing. In those earliest eons of cosmic development, the collector had been part of a species whose nature defied easy comprehension by minds that had evolved within the constraints of linear time and three-dimensional space. They were beings of pure curiosity and creative impulse, entities whose primary purpose was to explore, catalogue, and preserve the infinite varieties of existence that the expanding universe was constantly generating. Their role was not unlike that of cosmic librarians or universal archivists, though such mundane comparisons could barely capture the scope and significance of their actual function. The collector's siblings, known collectively as the archivists, shared this fundamental drive to collect and preserve, but they approached their cosmic responsibilities with a methodical precision and emotional detachment that allowed them to view entire civilizations as specimens rather than communities of living, feeling beings. They saw beauty in the patterns and structures that emerged from complex systems, but they felt no particular attachment to the individual components that created those patterns, or concern for the experiences of consciousness that existed within those systems. This difference in perspective, which might have seemed insignificant to observers who could not distinguish between such subtle variations in cosmic temperament, would eventually lead to conflicts and consequences that echoed across multiple dimensions and influenced the development of countless worlds. The collector possessed the same vast power and ancient wisdom as their siblings, but they had retained something that the others had either never developed or had chosen to abandon: empathy for the small, brief lives that flickered through the material realms like candle flames in an infinite darkness. Where the archivist saw civilizations as collections of interesting specimens to be catalogued and preserved, the collector saw communities of individuals whose joys and sorrows, hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments were as real and important as any cosmic phenomenon. This perspective made them less efficient at their assigned role, but more capable of forming genuine connections with the beings they encountered during their explorations of the material realms. The discovery of the Titan represented one of the most significant encounters in the collector's unimaginably long existence, a meeting between two forms of cosmic consciousness that operated on similar scales of power and wisdom, but approached the fundamental questions of existence from radically different philosophical perspectives. The Titan embodied sacrifice and service, the willingness to give up individual existence in order to nurture and protect countless smaller lives. The collector embodied curiosity and preservation, the desire to explore and catalogue the infinite varieties of experience that the universe made possible. Their relationship began as a friendship between equals who could appreciate each other's perspectives, while maintaining their own distinct approaches to cosmic responsibility. The Titans shared stories of the civilizations that had developed within and around its massive form, while the Collector described the wonders they had discovered during their travels through dimensions that the Titan's physical nature prevented it from exploring directly. The games that the Collector played with the Titan were expressions of cosmic creativity that spanned scales from the microscopic to the galactic, entertainment that involved reshaping reality itself, according to rules and objectives that changed as quickly as the participants could imagine new possibilities. These games were not mere diversions, but rather explorations of potential, investigations into what might be possible if the fundamental laws of existence could be modified or temporarily suspended. However, the Collector's understanding of appropriate boundaries and consequences was shaped by their cosmic perspective and nearly unlimited power, creating a dangerous disconnect between their intentions and their actions. What seemed like harmless play to a being who could casually manipulate space and time could have devastating effects on smaller creatures who lacked the power to protect themselves from cosmic-scale interference. The incident that led to the Collector's imprisonment began as one of their typical reality-reshaping games, an attempt to create new forms of entertainment by temporarily altering the laws of physics and causality within the Titan's realm. The Collector's intentions were entirely benevolent from their own perspective, aimed at creating wonders and marvels that would bring joy and excitement to all the creatures who called the Titan's body home. The game involved shifting the relationships between different forms of matter and energy, allowing solid objects to become fluid, making gravity optional rather than mandatory, and permitting time to flow in spirals rather than straight lines. From the Collector's cosmic viewpoint, these changes were temporary modifications that would create interesting new experiences for everyone involved before being reversed with no lasting consequences. The reality for the countless small beings caught within the game's effects was far different and far more terrifying. Creatures whose entire existence depended on the stability of natural laws suddenly found themselves in a world where nothing could be relied upon, where the ground beneath their feet might dissolve without warning, where the air they breathed might transform into something toxic or simply cease to exist entirely. The terror and suffering that resulted from this cosmic game were beyond anything the Collector had intended or anticipated, but their efforts to correct the situation only made things worse. Each attempt to restore stability created new forms of chaos, while their increasingly desperate efforts to undo the damage they had caused resulted in reality fluctuations that threatened the structural integrity of the entire realm. The Titans' response to this crisis demonstrated the profound difference between their cosmic perspectives and fundamental values. Where the Collector saw an unfortunate accident that required technical solutions and reality manipulation to correct, the Titans saw a violation of the sacred trust that existed between powerful beings and the smaller lives they were meant to protect and nurture. The confrontation that followed was one of the most significant cosmic conflicts in the history of the demon realm, a battle between two entities whose power levels were comparable, but whose moral frameworks were entirely incompatible. The Titan fought not out of anger or desire for revenge, but out of absolute necessity to protect the countless lives that depended on the stability and safety of their realm. The magical prison that the Titan created to contain the Collector was not merely a physical barrier, but a complex multi-dimensional construct that isolated the cosmic entity from the material realm while preventing them from exercising their reality-altering abilities. The prison was designed to be both secure and humane, providing the Collector with a form of existence that would not drive them to madness or despair, while ensuring they could never again pose a threat to innocent lives. The isolation that followed was perhaps the most profound punishment that could have been inflicted upon a being whose entire nature revolved around exploration, interaction, and play. The collector found themselves cut off from the cosmic community of their siblings, unable to travel between dimensions or engage with the countless varieties of existence that had once provided meaning and purpose to their eternal life. The psychological effects of this isolation accumulated over the millennia like sediment in a deep ocean, gradually transforming the collector's personality and perspective in ways that would have profound implications for their eventual liberation. The playful cosmic entity who had caused the original crisis through careless benevolence slowly evolved into something more complex and potentially more dangerous, a being whose loneliness and frustration had created depths of need and desire that had never existed before. The connection that the collector maintained with King throughout his early development represented their only form of meaningful interaction with another conscious being during the long centuries of imprisonment. This relationship became the focal point of their existence, the single thread of connection that prevented them from descending completely into madness or despair, while also creating a form of emotional dependency that was unprecedented in their cosmic experience. King's own nature as the last surviving member of the Titan species created a resonance between his fundamental loneliness and the collector's imposed isolation, though neither fully understood the deeper connections that bound them together. From King's perspective, the collector was an imaginary friend who appeared during his dreams and play sessions, a companion who could share in games and adventures that were too elaborate and fantastic for any real person to participate in. From the collector's perspective, King represented hope for eventual freedom and the promise of genuine friendship with someone who could appreciate their cosmic perspective, while also grounding them in the reality of individual experience and emotion. The relationship they developed was simultaneously the healthiest and most problematic connection either had ever experienced, providing essential emotional support, while also creating expectations and dependencies that would prove difficult to manage once the imprisonment ended. The games that the collector shared with King during these dream encounters were careful and controlled versions of the cosmic play that had once gotten them into so much trouble. They created elaborate fantasy scenarios and magical adventures that could unfold within the safety of King's imagination without affecting the external world or endangering any innocent lives. These shared experiences gradually taught the collector lessons about appropriate scale and consideration for consequences that they had never learned during their earlier cosmic existence. Through King's reactions and responses, they began to understand how their actions affected others and to develop the kind of empathy and caution that might have prevented the original crisis that led to their imprisonment. However, the isolation also warped their perspective in ways that created new problems and potential dangers. The collector's understanding of social interaction became increasingly limited to their relationship with King, while their knowledge of appropriate behavior and boundaries was filtered through the perspective of someone who had never experienced normal social development or learned to function within a community of equals. The emergence of Emperor Belos as a major threat to the demon realm created an opportunity for the collector's liberation that they could not have anticipated or planned for themselves. Belos's research into the ancient history of the realm had uncovered references to the cosmic entity imprisoned beneath the Titan's surface, along with speculation about the power that such a being might possess if properly approached and manipulated. The initial contact between Belos and the collector was tentative and exploratory on both sides, with each party attempting to assess the potential value of alliance with the other, while concealing their own true intentions and capabilities. Belos approached the relationship as he did all his interactions, viewing the collector as a tool to be used for his own purposes and eventually discarded when their usefulness ended. The collector, desperate for any form of meaningful interaction after centuries of isolation, was willing to overlook obvious warning signs about Belos's character and intentions in exchange for the promise of freedom and the return of their ability to interact with the material world. Their cosmic perspective and emotional immaturity made them vulnerable to manipulation by someone who understood how to exploit their loneliness and desire for connection. The bargain that they eventually struck represented a tragic convergence of mutual deception and self-deception. Belos convinced himself that he could control and eventually eliminate the Collector once their power had served his purposes, while the Collector convinced themselves that Belos was a friend who would appreciate their cosmic perspective and perhaps even become a replacement for the relationship they had lost when they were separated from their siblings. The assistance that the Collector provided to Belos during the preparation and execution of the Day of Unity was motivated not by any agreement with his goals or approval of his methods, but by their desperate desire to regain their freedom and resume their exploration of the material realm. They understood that Belos's plan would cause massive destruction and loss of life, but their isolation had dulled their empathy, and their cosmic perspective made it difficult for them to fully comprehend the significance of individual mortality. The moment of the Collector's liberation during the climax of the Day of Unity represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power within the demon realm, replacing one form of tyranny with another that was potentially even more dangerous, despite being motivated by play rather than hatred. The entity that emerged from their cosmic prison was not the same being who had been imprisoned centuries earlier, but rather someone who had been fundamentally changed by isolation and manipulation. The immediate transformation of the demon realm that followed the Collector's liberation demonstrated both the extent of their power and the degree to which their perspective had been distorted by their long imprisonment. Their first act was to reshape reality according to their own desires and preferences, creating a playground that reflected their cosmic imagination without regard for the needs or desires of the beings who already lived within the realm. The society that the Collector created was not intentionally malevolent, but was terrifyingly indifferent to individual agency and consent. They transformed living beings into game pieces and toys, modified the landscape to serve as entertainment venues, and imposed rules and objectives on everyone within their reach, without considering whether such modifications were wanted or appropriate. The relationship between the Collector and King during this period was particularly complex and emotionally fraught, representing both the fulfillment of their long-cherished dream of friendship and a source of new forms of loneliness and disappointment. King was no longer the small, helpless creature who had provided companionship through dream encounters, but had grown into an individual with his own opinions, relationships, and responsibilities. The Collector's attempts to recreate the intimacy and simplicity of their earlier relationship came into conflict with King's growth and development as a person, creating tension and misunderstanding that neither was initially equipped to address constructively. The cosmic entity's expectation that their friendship could simply resume where it had left off ignored the fundamental changes that both had undergone during the intervening years. The gradual evolution of the Collector's understanding and empathy during their brief period of freedom represented one of the most hopeful aspects of their story, demonstrating that even cosmic entities could learn and grow when exposed to appropriate influences and given the opportunity to form genuine relationships. Their interactions with Luz, King, and the other inhabitants of the demon realm slowly began to teach them lessons about consent, consideration, and the importance of individual autonomy. However, this growth process was also fraught with setbacks and dangerous moments when their immense power combined with their emotional immaturity to create situations that threatened the safety and well-being of everyone around them. The Collector's journey toward emotional and social maturity was necessarily a collective experience that required patience, understanding, and occasionally firm boundaries from those who were helping to guide their development. The ultimate resolution of the collector's story arc represented not just personal growth for the cosmic entity, but also a broader statement about the possibility of redemption and positive change, even for those whose past actions have caused tremendous harm. Their decision to use their power for restoration rather than continued domination marked a fundamental shift in their understanding of what it meant to be a responsible cosmic being. The Day of Unity dawned with a brilliance that seemed to mock the darkness of its true purpose, the sun rising over the boiling isles with the same golden warmth that had blessed countless peaceful mornings throughout the realm's long history. Unaware that this particular day had been chosen as the moment when centuries of careful planning would finally culminate in an act of genocide disguised as celebration. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation and barely contained magical energy, though whether this atmosphere reflected the genuine excitement of the population or the malevolent forces that Emperor Belos had set in motion was a distinction that few would live long enough to contemplate. Across every district and settlement within the Emperor's domain, the preparations that had been months in the making reached their final stages as covens gathered their members for the great ceremony that would supposedly unite all forms of magic under Belos's divine guidance and create a new, golden age of prosperity and harmony for the demon realm. The propaganda machine that had spent years convincing the population to view this event as the fulfillment of their highest aspirations operated at peak efficiency, flooding every available channel of communication with messages of hope, unity, and the promise that today would mark the beginning of a better world for all magical beings. The irony was so profound and so terrible that it would have been laughable if the stakes had not been measured in millions of innocent lives. The witches and demons who gathered in celebration of their supposed liberation were actually assembling for their own systematic destruction. Their enthusiastic participation in the ceremony, serving as willing cooperation in Belos's final solution to what he had convinced himself was the problem of wild magic's continued existence within the realm he claimed to rule. The 9 coven heads who stood at the center of this elaborate charade each carried within their minds a mixture of genuine belief in their cause and carefully suppressed doubts about the methods they had been asked to employ in service of Besses. That cause, some, like Adrian Gray of the Illusion Coven, had embraced their roles with the enthusiasm of true believers, who saw themselves as instruments of divine will. Others, like Darius Demon of the Abomination Coven, had begun to question whether the unity they were promising would truly benefit anyone other than the Emperor himself. Rain Whispers, the head of the Bard Coven, whose musical magic would play a crucial role in coordinating the vast ritual that was about to unfold, carried the heaviest burden of all the ceremony's participants, for they alone among the coven heads knew the true nature of what was being attempted. Their involvement in the underground resistance movement had provided them with intelligence about Belos's real intentions, transforming their participation in the Day of Unity from willing cooperation into an act of desperate sabotage that would either save the realm or die trying. The discovery of the truth behind Belos's grand plan had come through months of careful investigation and infiltration by resistance members who had risked everything to penetrate the Emperor's inner circle and uncover the real purpose behind the ceremony that was being promoted as salvation for all magical beings. The evidence they had gathered painted a picture of such calculated evil that many initially refused to believe it could be true, unable to accept that anyone could orchestrate the destruction of an entire civilization while convincing its victims to celebrate their own annihilation. The draining spell that formed the heart of the Day of Unity was a masterpiece of magical engineering that combined ancient knowledge with twisted innovation to create something that had never existed before in the history of the demon realm, a method for simultaneously extracting the life force from millions of magical beings while they remained unaware of what was happening to them until it was far too late to resist or escape. The spell's design was elegantly simple in its basic concept while fiendishly complex in its execution, requiring the coordinated participation of all 9 major covens to create a magical network that could span the entire realm and connect every coven member to a single central collection point. The coven brands that each member carried on their wrist would serve as both identification markers and magical conduits, allowing the spell to target and drain specific individuals while leaving others untouched. The technical brilliance of this approach was matched only by its moral horror, representing the culmination of everything that was wrong with Belos's understanding of magic, power, and the value of individual life. The Emperor had spent centuries studying and perfecting this technique, testing various components on smaller scales and gradually refining the process until he was confident that it could achieve his ultimate goal of eliminating every magical being in the realm, while preserving himself as the sole survivor and ruler of a cleansed world. The ritual itself was designed to unfold in stages that would maintain the illusion of celebration and unity right up until the moment when the draining began in earnest, ensuring maximum participation and minimum resistance from the intended victims. The early phases would involve traditional magical displays and ceremonial elements that would seem familiar and appropriate to anyone who had attended similar gatherings in the past, gradually building toward the climactic moment when the true nature of the ceremony would be revealed. Hunter's discovery of his artificial nature as a Grimwalker had shattered more than just his understanding of his own identity. It had destroyed his faith in everything he had been taught to believe about his purpose, his destiny, and the righteousness of the cause he had devoted his life to serving. The revelation that he was not the chosen successor to Emperor Belos's legacy, but merely the latest in a long line of disposable artificial beings created to serve as tools and eventually be discarded, came as a psychological blow that threatened to unmake his entire sense of self. The process of accepting this truth required Hunter to re-examine every aspect of his existence and question every assumption he had made about his relationship with the man he had believed to be his uncle and mentor. The memories that he had treasured as evidence of genuine care and affection were revealed to be calculated manipulations designed to ensure his loyalty and obedience, while the special treatment he had received was exposed as the kind of attention one might give to a valuable but ultimately replaceable piece of equipment. The emotional impact of this revelation was compounded by the growing awareness that his predecessor Grimwalkers had likely gone through the same process of discovery and disillusionment before being eliminated and replaced, creating a cycle of betrayal and destruction that had repeated itself countless times throughout Belos's long reign. Hunter found himself haunted by questions about how many other versions of himself had existed, how they had lived and died, and whether any of them had found a way to break free from the pattern that seemed to define their artificial existence. The decision to join the resistance movement represented not just a rejection of Belos's authority, but a fundamental choice to define himself as something other than what he had been created to be, to assert his own agency and moral judgment against the programming and conditioning that had shaped his entire development. This choice was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, offering the possibility of authentic existence while also removing the certainty and structure that had previously given his life meaning and direction. The resistance cells that had formed throughout the Boiling Isles in response to growing awareness of Belos's true intentions represented a diverse coalition of individuals and groups who had little in common beyond their shared opposition to the Coven system and their determination to preserve the wild magic traditions that were under attack. These underground networks included former Coven members who had become disillusioned with the system they had once served, wild witches who had never accepted Coven membership in the first place, and ordinary citizens who had begun to question the official narrative about magical restriction and control. The coordination of resistance activities across such a vast and heavily monitored realm required careful planning, secure communication methods, and a level of operational security that many of the participants had no prior experience with maintaining. The risks were enormous, as discovery meant not just imprisonment or execution, but also the exposure of entire networks and the destruction of years of careful preparation and relationship building. Ida Clawthorne's role in these resistance efforts was complicated by her status as the realm's most wanted criminal, a reputation that made her simultaneously valuable as a symbol of defiance and dangerous as a target for increased surveillance and enforcement activity. Her knowledge of wild magic techniques and her network of contacts in the underground magical community made her an invaluable resource for resistance operations, while her personal vendetta against the Coven system provided motivation that went far beyond mere political opposition. The relationship between Edda and the more organized resistance cells was often tense and difficult to maintain, as her individualistic approach to rebellion sometimes conflicted with the collective planning and coordinated action that effective resistance required. Her tendency to operate independently and take risks that could compromise larger operations created ongoing friction with resistance leaders who were trying to balance immediate tactical goals with long-term strategic objectives. The discovery that Lilith had been manipulated into cursing her own sister years earlier provided one of the most shocking revelations about the personal cost of Belos's reign, and the way that his system of control corrupted even the most well-intentioned individuals. The curse that had tormented Ida for so much of her adult life was revealed to have been not a random magical accident or the result of her own reckless behavior, but rather the consequence of a desperate decision by someone who loved her and thought she was acting in her sister's best interests. The Emperor's Coven recruitment process that had led to Lilith's fateful choice had been designed specifically to exploit the competitive dynamics between talented young witches and push them toward decisions they would never have made under normal circumstances. The promise that joining the Emperor's Coven would provide Lilith with the resources and authority needed to help her cursed sister had been a calculated manipulation that used her genuine love and concern as leverage to secure her loyalty and compliance. The revelation of this truth created a crisis of faith for Lilith that paralleled Hunter's own disillusionment with Belos's regime, forcing her to confront the possibility that everything she had sacrificed in service of the Emperor's cause had been based on lies and false promises. The career she had built, the relationships she had destroyed, and the moral compromises she had accepted were all revealed to have been in service of goals that were not just different from what she had believed, but actively opposed to everything she actually valued and cared about. The decision to break with the Emperor's Coven and join the resistance movement required Lilith to abandon not just her position and status, but also her entire sense of identity and purpose, leaving her without the institutional framework that had defined her adult life, and forcing her to discover who she was when stripped of rank and official authority. This process of redefinition was both painful and liberating, offering the possibility of authentic relationships and genuine moral agency, while also requiring her to accept responsibility for the harm she had caused during her years of service to a corrupt system. The final preparations for the Day of Unity involved positioning resistance members within the ceremony itself, placing them where they could potentially disrupt the ritual if the opportunity arose, while also gathering intelligence about the exact mechanisms that Belos intended to use to implement his genocidal plan. This infiltration required careful coordination and timing, as any premature action could alert the Emperor's forces and lead to the complete destruction of the resistance movement before it could accomplish its goals. The magical components required for the draining spell had been gathered from across the realm over a period of months, with Belos's agents collecting rare materials and artifacts that few understood the true purpose of, but which would prove essential for channeling and focusing the enormous energies that the ritual would require. The scale of these preparations was so vast that it should have been impossible to conceal. Yet, the compartmentalized nature of the Emperor's organization and the genuine enthusiasm of most participants for the supposed unity ceremony provided perfect cover for activities that would otherwise have raised obvious red flags. The positioning of the 9 coven heads around the ritual circle represented more than just ceremonial placement. It was a carefully calculated arrangement that would maximize the efficiency of magical energy transfer, while also ensuring that any attempt to disrupt the spell would require simultaneous action at multiple points that were too far apart. For effective coordination, this design made successful sabotage extremely difficult, while also providing multiple backup systems in case one or more of the primary components failed to function as intended. The moment when the ritual began in earnest marked the point of no return for everyone involved, as the magical forces that Belos had spent centuries learning to control were unleashed on a scale that dwarfed anything that had been attempted in the realm's recorded history. The energy patterns that began to flow between the coven heads and their assembled members created a network of power that could be felt by every magical being within hundreds of miles, a sensation that began as excitement and anticipation, but gradually transformed into something far more ominous and threatening. The initial phases of the draining spell manifested as subtle changes in the participants' energy levels and magical abilities, effects that could easily be attributed to the excitement of the ceremony or the natural fatigue that comes from participation in extended magical rituals. The coven members who formed the primary targets of the spell began to experience a gradual weakening of their magical abilities that was initially interpreted as a normal consequence of contributing their power to the Great Unity spell that would supposedly benefit everyone involved. As the ritual progressed and the draining effects became more pronounced, some participants began to realize that something was seriously wrong with what was supposed to be a celebration of magical unity and empowerment. The physical symptoms of magical energy loss began to manifest as weakness, disorientation, and in some cases actual collapse, creating visible evidence that contradicted everything that had been promised about the ceremony's beneficial effects. The resistance members who had positioned themselves throughout the crowd began to act on their emergency plans, attempting to warn other participants about the true nature of what was happening, while also working to disrupt the magical connections that were feeding power to the central ritual. These efforts faced enormous obstacles, as the spell's design made it extremely difficult to interrupt once it had reached a certain level of intensity, while the chaos and confusion among the participants made organized resistance nearly impossible to coordinate. Rain Whispers's position as head of the Bard Coven provided them with a unique opportunity to sabotage the ritual from within, as their musical magic was essential for maintaining the harmonic frequencies that kept the various magical energies properly synchronized and flowing in the intended directions. The decision to use this position for sabotage rather than cooperation required enormous personal courage, as it meant abandoning any hope of survival in favor of a desperate attempt to save others from the fate that Belos had planned for them. The magical feedback that resulted from Rain's sabotage efforts created cascading failures throughout the ritual network, disrupting the carefully balanced energy flows and causing dangerous instabilities that threatened to tear apart the entire magical framework that held the ceremony together. These disruptions provided openings for other resistance members to act, creating a brief window of opportunity when coordinated action might still be able to prevent the completion of the draining spell. The revelation of Belos's true form during the climax of the failed ritual represented the ultimate unmasking of the deception that had sustained his rule for so many years. As the magical disguises and illusions that had hidden his corrupted nature were stripped away by the chaotic energies that his own spell had unleashed, the creature that stood revealed before the assembled crowds was not the divine messenger he had claimed to be, but rather something monstrous and alien that bore no resemblance to any natural form of life in the demon realm. The psychological impact of witnessing this transformation was almost as devastating as the physical danger it represented, as thousands of Coven members were forced to confront the reality that everything they had believed about their emperor and their society had been built on lies so fundamental that their entire worldview crumbled in a matter of moments. The creature they had worshipped and obeyed was revealed to be not just evil but utterly inhuman, a being whose very existence was antithetical to everything that made life in the demon realm possible and worthwhile. The battle that erupted in the aftermath of the ritual's collapse was unlike anything that had been seen in the Boiling Isles since the ancient wars that had preceded the establishment of the current civilization. A conflict that pitted the full military might of the Emperor's remaining loyal forces against a resistance movement that was simultaneously strengthened by righteous anger and weakened by the magical drain that many of its members had suffered during the interrupted ceremony. The intervention of the Collector at this crucial moment represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict, as their liberation from centuries of imprisonment introduced a force that operated on an entirely different scale of power and whose motivations and goals were completely separate from the political and ideological struggles that had defined the resistance movement. The cosmic entity's first actions upon gaining freedom demonstrated both their immense capabilities and their dangerous lack of understanding about appropriate limits and consequences. The transformation of reality that followed the Collector's emergence was total and instantaneous, changing the fundamental rules that governed existence within the demon realm and replacing them with new principles that reflected the cosmic entity's desire for entertainment and play, rather than the natural laws that had previously maintained the stability and continuity of the physical world. This transformation was not malevolent in its intent, but was terrifyingly indifferent to the needs and desires of the beings whose lives were being reshaped without their consent or consultation. The petrification of Emperor Belos represented both a form of justice for his crimes and a demonstration of the arbitrary nature of the Collector's power, as the tyrant, who had spent centuries imposing his will on others, was reduced to an immobile statue with no more agency or influence than any other decorative object in the Collector's new playground. The speed and casualness with which this transformation was accomplished served as a stark reminder that the cosmic entity's power operated on levels that made even the most sophisticated magical techniques seem primitive and ineffective. The fate of the resistance members and ordinary citizens who had participated in or witnessed these events varied widely depending on their proximity to the ritual site and their specific roles in the unfolding drama, but all were fundamentally changed by their experience of witnessing the collapse of one form of tyranny and its immediate replacement by another that was potentially even more dangerous despite being motivated by play rather than hatred. The survivors who managed to escape the immediate chaos faced the challenge of adapting to a world where the basic principles of reality had been altered by forces beyond their understanding or control, where magic itself might function according to new rules that bore no resemblance to the traditions and techniques they had spent their lives learning to master. The knowledge and skills that had previously defined their identities and capabilities were suddenly rendered obsolete by changes that had been imposed without warning or explanation. The Day of Unity had achieved a form of unity that was entirely different from what anyone had expected or desired, bringing together all the surviving inhabitants of the demon realm under the absolute authority of a cosmic entity whose power was matched only by their emotional immaturity and their dangerous lack of understanding about the consequences of their actions. The ceremony that was supposed to mark the beginning of a golden age of magical harmony had instead ushered in an era of cosmic uncertainty, where the only certainty was that nothing could be relied upon to remain constant or predictable. The human realm that welcomed Luz, Hunter, Willow, Gus, and Amity, after their desperate escape from the Collector's transformed version of the demon realm, was both achingly familiar and profoundly alien to each of them in different ways. A world that operated according to natural laws they understood intellectually, but had never truly experienced in practice. For Luz, this was a homecoming that carried within it all the complex emotions of returning to a place she had outgrown, while for her companions, it represented their first encounter with a realm where magic existed only in the dreams and stories of beings who had convinced themselves that wonder was something to be abandoned rather than cultivated. The transition from a reality where magic flowed as freely as water and thought could reshape the physical world to one where every effect required a mundane cause and every miracle had been explained away by scientific materialism was jarring beyond anything they could have anticipated. The simple act of reaching for magical abilities that had been as natural as breathing and finding nothing there created a sense of amputation and loss that went far deeper than mere inconvenience, touching the very core of their identities as magical beings suddenly cut off from the forces that had defined their entire existence. Camila Nocida's reaction to her daughter's unexpected return was a complex mixture of overwhelming relief, maternal concern, and barely controlled panic, as she struggled to process the reality that Luz had not only failed to attend the summer camp that was supposed to help her develop more realistic expectations about life, but had instead spent months in an augmentation, alternate dimension, learning actual magic from creatures that should not have been able to exist. The evidence of this impossible adventure was standing in her living room in the form of 4 teenagers whose very presence challenged everything she thought she understood about the nature of reality itself. The witch and demons who had accompanied Luz back to the human realm carried with them physical proof that magic was not merely a comforting fiction but an active force that had shaped entire civilizations and created wonders that surpassed anything human science had managed to achieve. Their pointed ears, their casual references to magical concepts and creatures, and their obvious discomfort with the magicless environment of suburban Connecticut served as constant reminders that the world was far larger and more mysterious than most humans were willing to acknowledge. Hunter's adjustment to life in the human realm was particularly difficult, as his entire sense of identity had been built around his role as a magical warrior and his connection to powers that were now completely inaccessible to him. The artificial nature of his existence as a grimwalker created additional complications, as he was forced to navigate not only the absence of magic, but also the fundamental questions about what it meant to be real in a world that would classify him as impossible if his true nature were ever discovered. The psychological impact of being cut off from his magical abilities was compounded by his ongoing process of recovering from the trauma and manipulation he had experienced during his years of service to Emperor Belos, creating a complex web of identity issues that required careful navigation and patient support from his newfound friends and family. The human realm's emphasis on individual therapy and psychological counseling provided resources that had not been available in the demon realm, though the challenge of explaining his circumstances to mental health professionals, who operated within entirely different frameworks of understanding, created additional complications. Willow's relationship with the natural world took on new dimensions in the human realm, where plants responded to conventional stimuli rather than magical communication, and where the deep connection she had always felt with growing things was reduced to ordinary botanical knowledge rather than mystical communion. The gardens and forests of Connecticut were beautiful in their own way, but they lacked the responsive consciousness that had made plant magic such an integral part of her identity and self-expression. The experience of being surrounded by plant life that could not hear her voice or respond to her intentions created a profound sense of loneliness and disconnection that was difficult for others to understand or address. The magic that had allowed her to communicate with and nurture growing things had been more than just a convenient ability. It had been a fundamental aspect of how she related to the world and understood her place within the larger ecosystem of life. Gus's fascination with human culture, which had been largely theoretical during his time in the demon realm, suddenly became an immersive educational experience as he found himself living within the society he had studied from a distance. The reality of human civilization was both more mundane and more complex than his academic research had suggested, filled with contradictions and nuances that could only be understood through direct experience rather than scholarly observation. The absence of illusion magic in his daily life forced him to develop new forms of creativity and expression, finding ways to create wonder and surprise through purely mundane means rather than the reality-bending techniques he had mastered in the demon realm. This challenge pushed him to explore aspects of human art and entertainment that he had previously overlooked, discovering that even without magic, humans had found ways to create beauty, meaning, and transformation through their various cultural practices. Amity's adjustment to human academic institutions provided her with an opportunity to test her intellectual abilities in an environment where magical talent could not substitute for hard work and careful study, though the absence of the competitive pressure she had experienced at Hexside allowed her to develop a healthier relationship with learning and achievement. The human educational system's emphasis on collaboration, rather than individual excellence, created space for personal growth that had been difficult to achieve within the coven-focused structure of Demon Realm society. The relationship that had developed between her and Luz during their time in the Demon Realm continued to evolve and deepen in the human realm, though they faced new challenges related to the social expectations and cultural norms of suburban American teenage life. The acceptance and support they received from Camila and the broader community provided a foundation of stability that allowed their bond to flourish despite the obvious differences in their backgrounds and origins. The search for historical information about the Witterbane brothers became a consuming obsession for the group as they gradually realized that understanding Philip's transformation into Emperor Belos was essential for finding a way to return to the demon realm and rescue their friends and family from whatever fate had befallen them under the Collector's chaotic rule. The local historical society, genealogical records, and preserved documents from Gravesfield's colonial period provided fragments of information that slowly began to coalesce into a picture of the events that had set the current crisis in motion centuries earlier. The discovery that Gravesfield itself had been built on the site of a 17th century settlement with direct connections to the witch-hunting activities that had shaped Philip's worldview added layers of historical irony and significance to their current situation. The town that had become Luz's childhood home was revealed to have been founded by people whose fear and hatred of magic had ultimately led to the creation of the greatest magical threat the demon realm had ever faced. The Gravesfield Historical Society's archives contained records and artifacts that painted a detailed picture of life in the original settlement, including documents that mentioned both Philip and Caleb Witterbane by name, and described some of the events that had led to their disappearance from the historical record. The official accounts were carefully sanitized to avoid any mention of supernatural elements, but careful reading between the lines revealed hints of the truth that had been deliberately obscured to protect the community's reputation and avoid difficult questions about the nature of the brothers' fate. The cottage that had served as the Witterbane family home still stood in the woods outside of town, preserved more by accident and neglect than by any deliberate historical conservation effort. The structure had been abandoned for centuries and allowed to fall into disrepair, but its basic framework remained intact and provided physical evidence that corroborated the documentary sources they had been studying. The exploration of the cottage revealed artifacts and personal belongings that had been left behind when the brothers departed for the demon realm, creating an intimate connection to the historical figures whose actions continued to influence events in the present day. Philip's diary, hidden in a secret compartment that had escaped the attention of previous visitors, provided first-hand testimony about his motivations and mental state during the period leading up to his transformation into Emperor Belos. The pages of this diary revealed the gradual corruption of Philip's thinking, as his exposure to wild magic and his guilt over Caleb's death combined to create the twisted ideology that would eventually drive him to attempt genocide against an entire realm. The entries chronicled his growing obsession with purification and control, his increasing isolation from normal human relationships, and his development of the magical techniques that would eventually allow him to extend his lifespan far beyond natural limits. Caleb's workshop, preserved in the cottage's basement, contained evidence of his own magical experiments and his attempts to understand and work with the forces he had encountered in the demon realm. The tools and materials he had collected showed a very different approach to magic than his brothers, one based on cooperation and harmony, rather than domination and control. The unfinished projects scattered throughout the space suggested that he had been working on ways to bridge the gap between the human and demon realms, perhaps hoping to create understanding and connection rather than the fear and hatred that had characterized his brother's response. The most significant discovery in the cottage was a partially constructed portal door, evidence that Caleb had been attempting to create a permanent gateway between the realms that would allow for regular communication and exchange rather than the dangerous one-way passages that had characterized previous interdimensional travel. The magical principles underlying this construction provided crucial insights into the nature of the barriers between worlds and suggested possible methods for reopening communication with the demon realm. The realization that Belos's invasion of the human realm was imminent came through a combination of supernatural signs and mundane evidence that painted a picture of impending catastrophe. The magical disturbances that began to manifest throughout Gravesfield were subtle at first, easily dismissed as coincidence or imagination by residents who had no framework for understanding supernatural phenomena. However, the pattern of these disturbances was unmistakable to those who knew what to look for and understood the implications of wild magic beginning to bleed through the barriers between worlds. The possessed animals that began appearing in increasing numbers throughout the town represented the advance guard of Belos's invasion force, creatures whose behavior had been altered by exposure to corrupted magical energy and who served as unwitting scouts and saboteurs preparing the way for their master's arrival. These animals retained their normal appearance, but displayed uncharacteristic aggression and coordination that suggested external control rather than natural instinct. The town's residents began to experience strange dreams and visions that echoed the nightmares that had plagued their ancestors during the original witch-hunting period. as if the trauma and fear of those earlier events were somehow seeping back into the collective consciousness of the community. These psychological disturbances created an atmosphere of unease and suspicion that made it difficult for people to think clearly or work together effectively in response to the growing crisis. The emergence of Belos himself into the human realm was heralded by environmental changes that defied scientific explanation, but were immediately recognizable to anyone who had experienced the effects of concentrated malice and corrupted magic. The temperature dropped suddenly and dramatically. Plant life began to wither and die without apparent cause, and the very air seemed to thicken with a malevolent presence that made breathing difficult and clear thinking nearly impossible. The creature that had once been Philip Witterbane bore little resemblance to either his original human form or the carefully constructed Emperor Belos persona that had dominated the demon realm for centuries. The wild magic he had consumed and the corruption he had embraced had transformed him into something that existed at the intersection of organic and mechanical, human and demon, past and present. His appearance shifted and flowed like liquid nightmare, incorporating elements of every creature he had devoured and every technique he had mastered in his centuries-long pursuit of power and control. The confrontation that unfolded in the streets of Gravesfield represented the collision of multiple historical timelines and cultural conflicts, as the witch-hunting mentality of the 17th century merged with the suburban normalcy of the 21st century in a battle that would determine the future of both realms. The townspeople who found themselves caught in the middle of this conflict had no preparation for dealing with forces that exceeded their understanding and threatened everything they believed about the nature of reality. The allies who rallied to support Luz and her friends in this final battle included not only the magical beings who had been transported to the human realm, but also unexpected assistance from humans who had been touched by magic in various ways throughout their lives. Camilla's transformation from concerned parent trying to protect her daughter from dangerous fantasies to active participant in the defense of both realms represented the kind of personal growth and expanded understanding that the parent crisis demanded from everyone involved. The revelation of Gravesfield's true history and its connection to the current crisis helped to mobilize some of the townspeople who might otherwise have been paralyzed by fear or disbelief, as they began to understand that their community's fate was intimately connected to events and decisions that had been made centuries earlier by their own ancestors. The guilt and responsibility that came with this knowledge created additional motivation for action, rather than passive acceptance of whatever fate Belos intended to impose upon them. The battle itself was fought on multiple levels simultaneously, combining physical confrontation with psychological warfare and spiritual conflict, as Belos attempted to corrupt and control everyone around him, while his opponents worked to preserve not only their own lives but also their essential humanity and connection to the values that made existence meaningful. The weapons used in this conflict ranged from improvised physical tools to recovered magical artifacts to the pure force of will and determination that drove ordinary people to extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice. The turning point in the conflict came when Luz fully embraced her role as the Titan's chosen champion, accepting the responsibility and power that came with that position, while also maintaining her essential humanity and connection to both realms. The magical abilities that flowed through her during this climactic battle were unlike anything she had previously experienced, representing not just personal power, but also the collective will and hope of everyone who depended on her success. The defeat of Belos required not just superior magical force, but also the kind of moral clarity and spiritual strength that could resist his attempts at corruption and manipulation, demonstrating that the ultimate victory of good over evil depended as much on character and choice as on raw power or technical skill. The destruction of his physical form was only the beginning of the healing process that would be required to repair the damage he had caused to both realms and all the lives he had touched with his hatred and fear. The aftermath of this final confrontation left both the human and demon realms forever changed, with barriers between worlds that had previously seemed absolute, now revealed to be permeable and conditional rather than permanent and fixed. The knowledge and experience gained through this crisis created opportunities for understanding and cooperation that had never existed before. Though realizing these opportunities would require continued effort and commitment from people in both realms who were willing to work towards something better than what had come before. The realm between life and death that Luz found herself traversing after her mortal body had been destroyed in the final battle against Belos was unlike anything she could have imagined during her time among the living. A space that existed outside the normal flow of time and causality, where consciousness could persist without physical form and communication, could occur through pure intention rather than spoken words. This liminal dimension served as a bridge between the material world she had known and whatever lay beyond, a place where souls could pause in their journey toward whatever final destination awaited them, and where the boundaries between individual identity and cosmic unity became fluid and permeable. The landscape of this in-between realm reflected neither the familiar geography of the human world nor the fantastic topography of the demon realm, but rather seemed to be constructed from memory, emotion, and symbolic meaning rather than physical matter. The ground beneath her feet felt solid and real despite being composed of crystallized starlight and compressed dreams, while the sky above shimmered with colors that had no names in any mortal language and stretched infinitely in directions that should not have been possible within any coherent system of three-dimensional space. The presence that awaited her in this impossible place was simultaneously vast beyond comprehension and intimately familiar, a consciousness so enormous that it contained entire galaxies within its thoughts, yet so gentle and personal that it felt like coming home to a parent she had never known she was missing. This was the Titan whose body had become the foundation of the demon realm, whose heart still beat with the rhythm of wild magic, and whose sacrifice had made possible everything beautiful and meaningful that had ever existed within the realm that Luz had come to love more than her own life. The Titan's appearance in this realm transcended any single physical form, manifesting instead as a constantly shifting amalgamation of every creature that had ever lived within the bounds of their transformed body, every plant that had grown in soil made from their flesh, every drop of water that had flowed through rivers carved from their bones. Yet beneath this overwhelming diversity of form was a singular consciousness that radiated the kind of unconditional love and acceptance that Luz had spent her entire life searching for without fully understanding what she was seeking. The conversation that unfolded between them operated on levels of meaning and understanding that went far beyond the simple exchange of information, touching depths of truth and wisdom that could only be accessed by souls who had temporarily stepped outside the limitations of mortal existence and gained perspective on the vast patterns that shaped the development of consciousness across cosmic time. The Titan's words carried within them the accumulated experience of eons, the distilled wisdom of countless lives lived and deaths faced, and the patient understanding that came from observing the eternal dance between creation and destruction that defined the fundamental nature of existence. The revelation of Luz's true role in the cosmic order came not as a sudden shock or dramatic announcement, but as a gradual recognition of something that had always been true, but had been hidden from her conscious awareness by the necessary limitations of mortal perspective. She had never been simply a human who had stumbled accidentally into the demon realm, but rather a soul that had been carefully chosen and prepared across multiple lifetimes for the specific purpose of serving as the Titan's champion. in their realm's moment of greatest need. The magical abilities she had developed, the relationships she had formed, and even the personal struggles she had faced throughout her life had all been part of a larger pattern designed to prepare her for this ultimate confrontation with the forces of hatred and destruction that threatened everything the Titan had sacrificed their existence to protect and nurture. Her journey from confused teenager to powerful witch to cosmic champion had been guided by forces she had never fully understood, but had always trusted on some level deeper than conscious thought. The power that the Titan now offered to share with her was not merely magical energy or enhanced abilities, but rather a fundamental connection to the creative force that had brought the demon realm into existence and continued to sustain it through every challenge and crisis it had faced throughout its long history. This power came not from domination or control, but from service and sacrifice, not from the desire to impose one's will upon the world, but from the willingness to become a conduit through which the world's own deepest needs and highest aspirations could be expressed and fulfilled. The acceptance of this power required Luz to surrender her attachment to her individual identity and personal desires, opening herself to become something larger and more universal, while simultaneously remaining grounded in the particular relationships and commitments that had given her life meaning and purpose. This paradox of becoming both more and less than herself was the key to wielding cosmic power responsibly, ensuring that it would serve the greater good rather than being corrupted by ego or selfish ambition. The process of integrating the Titan's power into her consciousness was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, as she felt her awareness expand to encompass not just her own thoughts and feelings, but the experiences of every living being that called the demon realm home. The joy and sorrow, hope and fear, love and anger of millions of individual lives flowed through her consciousness like a vast river of emotion and sensation that threatened to wash away everything that had made her uniquely herself. Yet even as she struggled to maintain her sense of individual identity in the face of this overwhelming cosmic consciousness, she began to understand that the power she was receiving was not meant to replace her humanity but to fulfill it, not to make her less human, but to make her the most human she had ever been. By connecting her to the universal experiences and aspirations that all conscious beings shared, regardless of their specific forms or circumstances. The Titan's explanation of Belos's true nature and the cosmic significance of their conflict provided context that transformed what had seemed like a personal struggle between good and evil into something far more universal and eternally relevant. Belos represented not just individual corruption and hatred, but the fundamental force of entropy and destruction that existed in eternal tension with the creative and nurturing impulses that the Titan embodied. This was not a conflict that could be permanently resolved, but rather an ongoing dance between opposing principles that would continue as long as consciousness existed anywhere in the universe. The responsibility that came with understanding this cosmic context was enormous, as it meant that Luz's choices and actions would have implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis facing the demon realm to influence the ongoing balance between creative and destructive forces throughout all of reality. The power to tip this balance in favor of life and growth came with the corresponding obligation to use that power wisely and with full awareness of the long-term consequences of every decision and action. The return to the material world that followed this cosmic communion was jarring in ways that went far beyond the simple transition from one physical location to another, as Luz found herself attempting to contain infinite consciousness within the finite boundaries of a mortal form while simultaneously channeling power levels that had never been intended to flow through individual beings. The very atoms of her body seemed to sing with energies that belonged to the realm of gods and cosmic forces, rather than teenage witches from suburban Connecticut. The battle that resumed upon her return was transformed by her new understanding and abilities from a desperate struggle for survival into something approaching a sacred ritual of purification and renewal, a cosmic ceremony in which the forces of creation would finally triumph over the accumulated hatred and fear that had poisoned the demon realm for centuries. The magical energies that flowed through her were not weapons in any conventional sense, but rather expressions of the fundamental life force that sought to heal rather than harm, to restore rather than destroy. The confrontation with Belos in his final form became a contest between two completely different understandings of what power meant and how it should be used. With his centuries of accumulated magical energy and corrupted knowledge pitted against her connection to the creative source that had brought their entire reality into existence, where he sought to dominate and control through force and intimidation, she offered understanding and compassion even to an enemy who had forfeited any claim to mercy or forgiveness through his actions. The magical duel that unfolded between them transcended the boundaries of normal combat to become something approaching a philosophical argument conducted through pure energy and will, with each attack and defense representing different approaches to fundamental questions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and moral responsibility. Belos's strikes carried within them all the bitterness and resentment he had accumulated during his centuries of isolation and self-imposed exile from normal emotional connection, while Luz's responses drew upon the love and acceptance she had found through her relationships with family and friends, both human and demon. The moment when Belos's corruption finally began to unravel under the pressure of the Titan's purifying energy was marked not by violence or destruction, but by a kind of cosmic sadness as the full tragedy of his existence became visible to everyone present. Here was a being who had possessed tremendous potential for good, but had chosen hatred over love, fear over courage, and isolation over connection, transforming himself through his own choices into something that could no longer recognize or appreciate any of the beauty and wonder that surrounded him. The final dissolution of his physical form was accompanied by a brief moment of clarity in which the human soul that had once been Philip Witterbane seemed to remember what he had lost and mourn for the path not taken, the relationships not cherished, and the opportunities for growth and connection that he had rejected in favor of his obsessive pursuit of power and control. This glimpse of what he might have been made, his ultimate fate, both more tragic and more hopeful, suggesting that even the most corrupted souls retained some spark of their original divine nature. The collector's response to witnessing this cosmic confrontation represented their own moment of profound realization about the nature of power and responsibility, as they saw demonstrated before them the difference between strength used for creation and growth versus strength used for domination and destruction. The contrast between Luz's selfless channeling of cosmic force for the benefit of all living beings and Belos's selfish hoarding of power for personal aggrandizement provided a clear example of the principles they needed to embrace if they were ever to use their own abilities constructively. The decision to actively participate in the healing and restoration of the demon realm, rather than simply continuing their cosmic games, represented a fundamental shift in the collector's understanding of what it meant to be a responsible cosmic entity, marking their transition from adolescent deity focused on personal entertainment to mature being committed to serving something larger than their own immediate desires and whims. This transformation was not instantaneous or complete, but represented the beginning of a growth process that would continue for eons to come. The restoration work that began immediately after Belos's final defeat required not just the repair of physical damage, but also the healing of psychological and spiritual wounds that had been inflicted on an entire civilization over the course of centuries. The coven system that had divided and weakened the magical community needed to be dismantled and replaced with institutions that celebrated rather than restricted magical diversity and creativity, while the fear and suspicion that had been deliberately cultivated between different groups needed to be transformed into understanding and cooperation. The process of rebuilding the magical education system provided an opportunity to correct centuries of deliberate miseducation and restore the authentic traditions and knowledge that had been suppressed or distorted by Belos's propaganda machine. Schools like Hexide Academy could once again become centers of genuine learning and exploration rather than indoctrination facilities designed to produce compliant coven members, while wild magic could be taught and practiced openly without fear of persecution or punishment. The emotional and psychological healing that was required proved to be even more challenging than the physical reconstruction, as entire generations of magical beings had grown up knowing only the restricted and fearful version of magic that the coven system had imposed upon them, learning to think of magic as a creative force, to be celebrated rather than a dangerous power, to be carefully controlled, required fundamental changes in worldview that could not be accomplished through simple policy changes or institutional reforms. The role that Luz played in this reconstruction process was both crucial and delicate, as her status as the Titan's chosen champion gave her enormous influence and authority, while her genuine commitment to democratic principles and individual freedom prevented her from using that authority to impose her own vision of what the restored realm should become. Instead, she worked to create spaces where different voices could be heard and different approaches could be tried, allowing the magical community to discover for itself what forms of organization and governance would best serve their collective needs and individual aspirations. The relationship between the demon realm and the human world that emerged from this crisis was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before, based on mutual understanding and voluntary exchange, rather than the fear and secrecy that had previously characterized interdimensional contact. The portal doors that connected the two realms could remain permanently open because both sides now understood the benefits of cooperation and cultural exchange, rather than viewing contact with the other world as a threat to be feared or an opportunity to be exploited. The magical renaissance that began to flourish in both realms as a result of this new openness exceeded anything that either world had achieved in isolation, as human creativity and ingenuity combined with demonic magical knowledge to produce innovations and discoveries that neither civilization could have developed independently. The scientific method that humans had developed for understanding natural phenomena proved remarkably applicable to magical research when combined with the intuitive understanding and direct experience that demonic practitioners brought to Arcane, their magical work. The personal transformations that each of the main characters underwent as a result of their experiences during this cosmic crisis were as significant as the broader social and political changes that reshaped both realms, representing the kind of individual growth and development that can only occur when people are faced with challenges that force them to transcend their previous limitations and discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. Luz's evolution from a lonely teenager, desperate to find her place in the world, to a cosmic champion, capable of channeling the creative force of the universe itself, while remaining grounded in her essential humanity, provided a model for the kind of balanced development that became possible when individual growth was supported by genuine community and meaningful relationships, rather than being distorted by competition and artificial scarcity. The future that stretched out before both realms was filled with possibilities that had been unimaginable before the barriers between worlds had been lowered and the artificial restrictions on magical development had been removed, offering opportunities for exploration, creativity, and growth that could occupy countless generations of beings committed to building something better than what they had inherited from the past. The Boiling Isles have been transformed, not into the sterile order that Belos envisioned, but into something far more beautiful, a realm where magic flows freely once more, where covens exist as communities of learning rather than limitations, and where difference is celebrated rather than feared. The years that have passed since the Day of Unity and its aftermath have witnessed a renaissance of magical creativity and interdimensional cooperation that surpasses anything either realm achieved in isolation, creating opportunities for growth and discovery that continue to unfold with each passing season. Luz's University for Interdimensional Magic serves students from both realms, its curriculum designed around principles of exploration and collaboration rather than restriction and competition. The institution represents everything that the old Hexide Academy might have become if it had been allowed to develop according to its original educational mission, rather than being perverted into a tool for producing compliant coven members. Here, young witches and demons study alongside human scientists and artists, each group bringing their own perspectives and methodologies to the collective enterprise of understanding and expanding the possibilities inherent in magical practice. The classrooms of this extraordinary institution buzz with conversations conducted in multiple languages and involving concepts that bridge the gap between scientific inquiry and mystical experience, while the laboratories showcase experiments that combine rigorous empirical methodology with intuitive magical understanding. Students learn not just how to cast specific spells or perform particular techniques, but how to think creatively about the fundamental nature of reality itself and their role as conscious beings capable of participating in the ongoing creation and transformation of the world around them. The portal door that once represented a dangerous secret or a pathway to exile now stands open as a symbol of the new relationship between worlds. Its frame decorated with symbols and artwork, contributed by beings from both realms who wish to celebrate the connections that have been established across dimensional boundaries. The gateway serves not as a means of escape or invasion, but as a bridge that allows for the free exchange of ideas, knowledge, and cultural practices that enriches both civilizations while threatening neither. Regular traffic flows through this portal in both directions, carrying students and scholars, artists and entrepreneurs, diplomats and tourists who are eager to experience the wonders and perspectives that the other realm has to offer. The fear and suspicion that once characterized interdimensional contact have been replaced by curiosity and respect, though both realms maintain appropriate protocols and safeguards to ensure that this exchange remains beneficial and voluntary for all participants. The Owl House remains a sanctuary, though its role has evolved from hiding place for magical outcasts to gathering point for friends and family who have chosen each other across species and dimensional boundaries. The building itself has grown and adapted to accommodate the expanded household that now includes not just Luz, Ida, and King, but also the various friends and allies who have become part of their chosen family over the years. The kitchen that once echoed with the sounds of improvised meals and hurried conversations now hosts elaborate dinner parties where human, witch, and demon guests share food and stories that bridge the gap between very different cultural traditions and life experiences. The living room serves as both comfortable retreat and meeting space for planning new adventures or collaborative projects, while the various workshops and studios provide space for magical experimentation and artistic creation that combines techniques and materials from both realms. Ida's transformation from wanted criminal to respected educator and mentor represents one of the most remarkable personal journeys of the post-Unity era, as she has found ways to channel her rebellious energy and vast magical knowledge into constructive rather than merely disruptive activities. Her classes on wild magic theory and practice are among the most popular and challenging offerings at Luz's university, drawing students who are eager to learn from someone whose understanding of magic was forged through decades of resistance to artificial limitations and bureaucratic control. The curse that once threatened to destroy her relationship with magic and with the people she cared about has been transformed through Ida and Lilith's shared efforts into something that resembles a manageable condition rather than a progressive disease. The sisters' collaboration on understanding and treating the curse's effects has deepened their relationship and created new forms of magical knowledge that have proven valuable for helping other beings who struggle with similar, transformative or degenerative magical conditions. King's discovery of his true identity as the last known member of the Titan species has brought with it both tremendous responsibility and remarkable opportunities for growth and self-discovery. The connection he maintains with the Titan's consciousness provides him with access to cosmic perspectives and ancient wisdom, while his essential personality and relationships keep him grounded in the day-to-day experiences that give life meaning and purpose. His role as bridge between cosmic and individual consciousness has made him an invaluable mediator and advisor for the various projects and initiatives that require both practical understanding and transcendent perspective. The playful, dramatic personality that once seemed like childish pretension has evolved into a form of charismatic leadership that inspires others while remaining fundamentally humble and service-oriented. The collector's integration into the social fabric of both realms represents perhaps the most challenging and ultimately rewarding aspect of the post-Unity reconstruction, as the cosmic entity has had to learn entirely new ways of relating to other conscious beings, while those around them have had to adjust to the presence of someone whose power, levels, and temporal perspective operate on scales that defy ordinary comprehension. The games that the collector now plays with their friends and students are carefully designed to enhance rather than disrupt the natural order, creating opportunities for learning and growth that would be impossible without their unique abilities, while respecting the autonomy and dignity of all participants. The transformation from cosmic child focused on personal entertainment to responsible adult committed to collective well-being has been gradual and sometimes difficult, but the results have exceeded everyone's expectations. Camilla's role as bridge between the human academic community and the magical university has proven essential for establishing the kind of institutional credibility and scientific legitimacy that allows for productive collaboration between researchers operating within very different paradigms and methodological frameworks. Her background in veterinary medicine has proven surprisingly relevant for understanding the biological aspects of magical practice, while her parental instincts have helped her serve as advocate and protector for students who are navigating the challenges of interdimensional education. The relationship between her and Luz has evolved from the typical parent-child dynamic into something more resembling a partnership between equals who share common goals and complementary skills, though the love and mutual concern that characterizes their bond remains as strong as ever. The fears and misunderstandings that once threatened to drive them apart have been transformed into sources of strength and deeper understanding. Hunter's journey from artificial being created to serve a tyrant to authentic individual, choosing his own path and relationships, represents one of the most profound transformations of personal identity and purpose that anyone in either realm has witnessed. The questions about what it means to be real or natural that once tormented him have been resolved not through philosophical analysis, but through the simple experience of being loved and accepted by people who value him for who he is, rather than what he was created to be. His work as counselor and advocate for other beings who have survived trauma and manipulation has given him a sense of purpose that connects his own healing process with meaningful service to others who face similar challenges. The artificial nature of his origin has become a source of unique insight rather than shame, allowing him to understand and assist others in ways that would be impossible for someone whose existence had followed more conventional patterns. Willow's role as coordinator of interdimensional agricultural and environmental projects has allowed her to expand her connection with plant life beyond the boundaries of any single realm, creating networks of botanical knowledge and ecological understanding that span multiple dimensions and species. Her work demonstrates the profound connections that exist between different forms of life, regardless of the specific realms or realities they inhabit. The gardens and experimental farms she has established serve as living laboratories where techniques developed in one realm are tested and adapted for use in others, creating new forms of sustainable agriculture that benefit both human and demonic communities while respecting the natural systems that support all forms of life. Her gentle strength and intuitive understanding of biological systems have made her an invaluable leader in efforts to heal the environmental damage that centuries of conflict and exploitation have inflicted on both realms. Gus's development from academically gifted but socially isolated child to confident leader and cultural ambassador represents the kind of personal growth that becomes possible when natural talents are nurtured within supportive communities rather than being exploited or suppressed by competitive systems. His expertise in illusion magic has evolved to encompass not just entertainment and education, but also therapeutic applications that help individuals and communities process trauma and envision positive futures. The cultural exchange programs he has developed help beings from both realms understand and appreciate the perspectives and traditions of the other, creating foundations for cooperation and mutual respect that go far deeper than simple tolerance or political alliance. His work demonstrates that the differences between species and cultures can become sources of enrichment rather than division when they are approached with curiosity and respect rather than fear and prejudice. Amity's transformation from perfectionist student terrified of making mistakes to confident innovator, willing to take creative risks, illustrates the profound changes in educational philosophy and social expectations that have characterized the post-Unity era. Her work developing new forms of magical theory that bridge the gap between intuitive practice and systematic understanding has created tools and techniques that make magical education more accessible and effective for beings with very papal fun, different learning styles and cultural backgrounds. The relationship between her and Luz continues to serve as a model for the kind of partnership that becomes possible when individuals from different backgrounds choose to support each other's growth while maintaining their own distinct identities and capabilities. Their collaboration on various projects demonstrates that love and respect can enhance rather than diminish individual achievement and creative expression. Rain's evolution from underground resistance leader to respected teacher and administrator illustrates the ways that the skills developed during times of crisis can be transformed into tools for positive construction during periods of peace and stability. Their understanding of how systems can be changed from within has proven invaluable for reforming educational and governmental institutions in ways that serve the genuine needs of the populations they are meant to help. The musical magic they practice and teach has become a powerful tool for community building and conflict resolution, creating shared experiences that transcend the boundaries between different species and cultural traditions while respecting the unique contributions that each group brings to the larger community. Their work demonstrates that resistance to oppression and construction of alternatives are complementary rather than contradictory activities. The broader magical community that has emerged from the ashes of the Coven system represents a fundamental reimagining of how diverse beings can organize themselves for mutual benefit while respecting individual autonomy and creative expression. The voluntary associations and collaborative networks that have replaced the rigid hierarchies and artificial limitations of the old system demonstrate that security and prosperity can be achieved through cooperation rather than control. The innovations in magical practice and theory that have emerged from this new environment of freedom and collaboration continue to expand the boundaries of what anyone thought was possible, creating new forms of artistic expression, healing techniques, communication methods, and problem-solving approaches that benefit everyone while harming none. The artificial scarcity and competition that once characterized magical education and practice have been replaced by abundance and sharing that make everyone stronger and more capable. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be transformed when people choose love over fear, cooperation over competition, and growth over control. The story of the Owl House and its inhabitants demonstrates that found families can be stronger than biological ones, that differences can become sources of strength rather than division, and that the magic we create together is always more powerful than anything we can achieve alone. The Boiling Isles sleep peacefully under stars that shine on beings of countless species and backgrounds who have chosen to build something beautiful together, while the portal between worlds stands open as a testament to the truth that barriers between peoples exist only in minds that have forgotten how to dream of better possibilities. Sweet dreams, and may your own journey toward understanding and connection unfold with the same courage and compassion that guided Luz and her friends through darkness toward the light of a new dawn.